Chapter 21. Always. Hallie.
"Be good to me, okay?"
Hallie whispered to the airship as she scrambled up the abandoned hover's wing. The brown metal winked at her in the little sunlight peeking through the angry clouds above, like it trusted her. She climbed into the cockpit, the rough metal seams scratching her palms. Hallie was alone, a good 2 miles outside of Nar, and about to do something incredibly stupid. She prayed Kase forgave her. Rumbling thunder echoed off the airship and through her skull. Nothing ever went the way she intended. She, Kase, and Yarrow would be running full speed into the pass with a storm on their heels, or on top of them. And, in the pass, the rain would become snow. That is, if Yarrow fulfilled his part of the plan and got Kase out of the holding cells. He had the easier task. Gracious day. Maybe the soldiers wouldn't come looking in the pass. They would probably mock the frozen bodies they found later instead. She didn't know if that was better than the alternative. Hallie brushed her sweaty, stinging hands on her trousers. She could almost feel Kase beside her as she pulled the glass closed and settled into the pilot's seat. The memory of their earlier escapade replayed in her mind. She shut her eyes tight as her stomach reenacted her reaction to the speed and subsequent air loop. Everything in her thumped along with her heart. After last fall, how could she be afraid of anything? Well, false bravado would have to work for now. She waited until another roll of thunder shook the hover. Yarrow was waiting on her signal, though he wasn't entirely sure what that signal was. He would figure it out fine. Hallie opened her eyes and inspected the dash. What to do first? Kase's voice floated through her mind. The most important thing you learn in flight school is safety. First, strap in. Of course, that's after you've checked the hover for issues, but let's pretend I already did. A nervous chuckle tumbled from her lips, as if she'd know what an issue was on a hover ship. And safety mattered little with what she was about to do, but she strapped in anyway. The thick material cut into her shoulders as she leaned forward, pressing the black button. A string of soft violin notes met her ears. Kase's song. The notes took the tension from her shoulders. She could do this. She allowed herself a breath before flipping the correct switch. The hum of the hover engines joined the ensemble. The odd symphony fortified her heart as she pressed the ship forward. She pushed the other lever at the same time to lift the craft off the rocky soil below. Wah! Her hand went too far, and the airship sprang into the air, her stomach flying into her throat. She yanked the control toward her, only for the ship's nose to rise sharply. She flew back against her seat as she screamed. She let go of the steering control and took her foot off the pedal. Tears bubbled up in the corners of her eyes as the ship righted itself, the hover components stabilizing the craft. Just a little bit at a time. Shutting her eyes, she pressed the pedal with her big toe, inching it, really. The craft edged forward. Just don't get too crazy. Her hands held the steering control in a death grip as she puttered toward Nar. She would need to speed up soon if her plan was going to work, yet the thought of doing so made her want to vomit. She slipped one hand off the control to feel for the lever between her legs. I can do this. Time is right. As the smudge on the darkening horizon morphed into cottages and shops of Nar, sweat beaded at Hallie's hairline. She pressed the pedal more, and the craft responded with a soft rumbling. She swallowed. Steering toward where she knew the other hovers waited, she sped up. She was only 15 feet in the air, but that was enough. She couldn't breathe. The air in the cockpit froze and burned at once. A brief image of Kase in that blasted gas mask flashed in her mind, but she didn't think this was what he'd meant. She couldn't remember which button would flash for that anyway. The small airfield didn't have individual hangars, only one large structure that sat at the edge of the runway. She'd be a fool to miss such a target. People, pilots and soldiers, pointed at her and scrambled out of the way. Her foot slammed the pedal until it smacked the floor, and she shrieked as she yanked the lever between her legs. Her head and neck flew forward as the force of ejection shot her straight into the air. Her safety straps dug into her shoulders as weight pressed onto her spine. The whoosh of air in her ears was loud, but the screeching boom from below was deafening. A direct hit. She still hadn't opened her eyes. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight to keep screaming even as her upward momentum stopped, and she fell. As suddenly as she'd been thrust into the air, the snapping of something shooting from the back of her seat made her eyes pop open. A parachute unfurled and caught the air with a pop. A large tug, and her descent slowed. She looked down. A mistake. She stiffened as ice flowed in her veins. The ground was too far, much too far, but she wasn't falling at her pace from earlier. The parachute was holding up. She peeked through her lashes at the airfield. Orange, red, and yellow flames engulfed what was left of the hangar. People like the ants of a destroyed nest ran amok. It looked like they were organizing a water bucket brigade. Hallie nearly choked on the burning bile in her throat. The ground was coming in fast, and before she knew it, the pilot's seat smacked the ground, the parachute fluttering over her. She didn't move. Eventually, she remembered the rest of her plan. She needed to get out of here before anyone arrested her. With shaking hands, she unbuckled herself, but a shout stopped her. She didn't recognize the voice. That wouldn't matter. "Take whoever that is into custody for questioning!" Fear like fire raced up Hallie's spine as she untangled herself from the straps. Her hair spilled over her eyes. She needed a way out. She couldn't fight them. Any weapons she might have used were now melting in the flames. Not that it would have made a difference. Think. She reached the edge of the parachute as the material was ripped off her. The hangar was 100 feet away, but the heat still warmed her face. The flames billowed from the top and side where the hover must have crashed. She looked away and dove into the arms of the soldier waiting there. He dropped his electropistol and caught her as she sobbed into his arms. That part wasn't acting.
Please, please help. I was kidnapped and I...
Her tears were coming so hard her words were mangled. The soldier pulled her to her feet. He held her at arm's length. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down." This man doesn't know women, does he? She wiped streaming snot from her upper lip and glanced toward the fire.
He took me. I tried to fight him, but he...
She couldn't catch her breath. Each sob choked her.
Is he dead?
The soldier looked toward the ruined hangar. "Someone else was flying? Who?"
Dunno. He was tall.
Her hands shook as she hid her face in them. The man let go of her shoulders. She blubbered into her fingers.
Pa's gonna be worried.
"We'll need to question you, miss. What was the name the trapper had called her earlier?" She couldn't recall it. She couldn't tell him her real name. Stars. Her eyes found the gentle rolls of the hills, the nearest illuminated by the fire.
Hallie.
Hallie. Now that was terrible. "Miss Hallie, please come with me. I'll take you down to the station."
But Pa, he doesn't know. I was in the market and...
"I'll have the deputy send for him." He held her elbow and steered her away, giving orders to others along the way, but Hallie was too entrenched in her own thoughts to pay close attention. She needed to lose him. She needed to get to the holding cells. She needed to get to the pass. As they entered the town proper, the first droplets fell onto Hallie's already wet face. Kase. The artistry of the holding cells was a mystery to Kase. Why put the time and effort into creating pointed arched door frames if one was only going to use the rooms to detain criminals? The doors themselves were of solid wood with a grate at eye level. Someone had cut it into that ridiculous shape, too. The walls were white and plain, the sliver of a window on the back wall too high to reach and too small to slide out of. The sleeping cot tucked under the window was clean. Really, the only terrible thing about it was the fact Kase could reach out and touch both walls with his arms outstretched. Well, that and the rudimentary chamber pot underneath the cot. It wasn't made of porcelain, metal, or anything useful for bludgeoning unsuspecting guards. Instead, it was soft and slick, and lighter than his copy of the Odyssey. The soldier who'd locked him in said the pot was only to be used in emergencies. He'd be let out to relieve himself in the lavatory before he went to sleep and before they left in the morning. Thoughtful of them. Criminals like Kase didn't deserve such treatment. What would Harlan think if he knew petty thieves and tax evaders were being treated so well? Or was Kase receiving special treatment because of his last name? A blessing and a curse. The room grew darker as the storm rolled in with the night. Stupid of him to think he could get away with being in the city after shooting down Ike. The other pilot must have drawn the short straw if he was chosen to go after Kase. Blasted poor luck. And then with Kase's face plastered all over town? Stars idiot. He couldn't help it. When they'd landed, the overwhelming feeling that he needed to go with Hallie hit him like a ton of bricks. The thought of saying goodbye to her for good? Well, he hadn't wanted to do that yet. A lot of good it did him. He would be heading back to Kaivenna at dawn once the storm passed. He wouldn't get to say goodbye at all. He massaged his temples. Hallie was safe. She'd be home soon. That was the most important part. Then he could forget about her and rot in Kaivenna's prison for the rest of his life. Or maybe he would hang, like Uncle Ezekiel. He wasn't sure which he preferred. The posters hadn't said what Kase was wanted for, but he knew. If it wasn't desertion or theft, it was something to do with the fire. Neither boded well for him, especially with a name like Shackley. He sat heavily on the end of the cot. What was Hallie doing now? Had she found a place to stay for the night? He hoped she wasn't at the tavern dancing with someone like Cornhead from Laurent. She deserved better than a farm boy who made empty promises. Kase played with the ring around his finger. What would Anna have thought of her? It was Kase's fault he'd never know the answer. Thunder boomed in the distance as Kase fell back and stared at the nondescript ceiling. Where was Anna now? Had Zeke joined her? Were they in some ether realm looking down on Kase? He didn't give much credit to a higher power. Clara did. She followed the Bible, one of the ancient texts that had survived the journey from First Earth and the millennium since. She'd tried to get Jove to read it, said something about living even after death. Kase didn't buy it. Neither did Jove. 92 people were dead because of the fire Kase started in Kaivenna over 3 years prior. Why did some all-powerful deity allow his creations to feel pain and anguish and anger? Why did he allow someone like Zeke to die in such a horrible way? He blinked away the image of his brother's death, of the blood pooling at his feet, of the metal door slamming in Kase's face. Maybe Kase didn't deserve to be free, to be happy. Kase didn't deserve to have a virtuous god to care for him. Zeke and Anna were dead. He hadn't been able to save either of them. Hallie was better off without him. That way she could live happily away from the grief and turmoil that was Kase's life. Kase dreaded the look on his father's face when he arrived back in the capital. The son who couldn't do anything right. Harlan wouldn't be able to pull any strings to get Kase free this time. Another rather loud rumble of thunder interrupted his thoughts. It was so loud that it shook his cell. He sat up as the screams started. What in the moons? Kase climbed onto his cot as the soldiers stationed at the detention cells spoke in rapid tones. He couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but whatever it wasn't about the storm. He still wasn't tall enough to see out the thin window, even standing on the cot. Grasping the edges of the sill, he pulled himself up. His forearms screamed with effort, and his boots slid while trying to gain traction on the wall. He grunted, but slowly raised himself enough to peek over the lip and see outside. The view wasn't much, just of the next building over, but above the roof an orange glow glimmered in the storm-darkened sky. He squeezed his eyes shut and let himself drop back to the cot. Shouts came from down the corridor. A fire. Blast. His hands shook as he stumbled over to the door. He pressed his ear to it and caught bits and pieces of conversation. Airfields. Captain Maltby. Send word to Achilles and to Colonel... A few doors slammed, more shouting. Kase stood on the tips of his toes to see out the door grate, but that didn't help one bit. He was too far from the commotion. Although distant, shouts and screams still filled the air. A new voice joined the fray, except this one came from the corridor.
If you're here, slicker boy, wave out that little grate on your door.
The rusty and haggard voice was familiar. Slicker boy? Kase waved fingers out the grate. Why the trapper was there, Kase didn't know, but whatever he had in store had to be better than heading to Kyvena at first light. Within seconds, the trapper's face was even with his. Shucks, Kase hadn't realized the man was so tall.
Get back. We don't want any busted noggins.
Kase did what he was told, and the door opened. A small boy about the age of 8 stood in the doorway with a gap-toothed grin and ring of keys in his grimy fingers. Kase frowned. What? How? The trapper grabbed Kase's arm and towed him out into the corridor. The young boy shut the door behind them and locked it.
Could I have my extra copper now?
Yarrow burrowed into his jacket and tossed a copper piece into the boy's waiting hands.
Put those keys back and get.
The boy scampered off, and Yarrow grabbed Kase by the collar and dragged him down the corridor. Kase tried to wriggle away, his stolen military jacket choking him a little until the trapper released him.
What in the blazes is going on?
Yarrow looked back.
I didn't realize prisoners of the state were ungrateful for a rescue.
No, not that.
Kase waved his hands.
Why you?
Yarrow shrugged and trudged down the hall.
Your girl is paying me extra.
My girl?
Kase's face lit like the fire currently burning somewhere in the city. He ran to catch up.
Where's Hallie?
They made it out of the corridor to the lobby. Both soldiers who'd been there when the captain and Ike had left him here were strewn like rag dolls on the floor behind the desk.
What?
Your girl paid me well, Yarrow said with a wink. I'm a man of my word where money's concerned.
The gap-toothed boy from earlier was just reattaching the ring of keys to one of the unconscious guard's trousers when the front door opened. Cold, wet air blew through and ruffled Kase's curls.
Please, I promise I'll come back. I just need to...
That voice. Kase looked up. Hallie was soaked to the bone. Her disarrayed red hair clung to her face and water dripped into the collar of her jacket and cloak. Shucks, rain like that would slow them down. He focused on the person next to her. His drenched uniform with the Jayde symbol on the right breast told him he was a soldier, but not one Kase recognized. He held Hallie's upper arm in a tight grip.
I already told you, miss. We'll call your father to the station and...
The soldier met Kase's eyes.
Hey, what are you...
Hallie looked up and sagged into the soldier's grip, her lips forming a relieved sigh. The soldier released her, his hand going to the electro-pistol at his side. The little boy was quicker. He kicked the soldier in the shins as Kase tackled him. Hallie screamed, and the small boy ran out the open door. Kase pinned the man's wrist to the floor and grabbed the electro-pistol holstered at the soldier's waist. The man's other arm launched at Kase, scratching his neck. Kase's fingers found the grip of the weapon and tugged it out. With a mighty swing, Kase whipped the soldier in the temple with the pistol barrel. The soldier went limp, his head knocking against the stone. The hand that had been trying to claw Kase's face fell away. Blood oozed from the cut on his temple and stained the end of the pistol grip. Kase's fingers lost all feeling. The electro-pistol clattered to the floor.
I didn't mean... Oh, shucks.
Hallie bent down and felt the man's neck, careful of the blood trickling down his face. She waited a minute before looking up at Kase. Her face was as white as snow.
He'll survive, I think.
Kase stumbled off the soldier. What if he didn't? What if Kase had dealt the man a delayed killing blow? He hadn't meant to. He hadn't been thinking clearly. All he knew was that if he didn't subdue the soldier, Kase would have been on the floor writhing in pain from an electrobolt. He tried to stand, but his legs weren't working correctly. The stone floor bit into his hands and knees as he fell to them. His breathing quickened. Pounding in his heart turned into a crushing pain. He clawed helplessly at his chest. His mouth was bone dry. Burning bile churned in his stomach. Zeke. His blood, deep red and slick, pooled on the ground. His shout, the slamming of the metal door.
Kase,
Hallie whispered, her cold hand cupping his cheek. The room spun.
We have to go, now, before someone comes.
Can't. He choked out the word. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the room was cold. Anna's blistered and bubbling skin, her tattered sweater, the smell of burned hair. The numbness of his fingers traveled through his hands, his wrists, his forearms. It begged for his heart. "Focus on breathing." Hallie squatted beside him, but he barely saw her. His vision had narrowed to a point. All he could see was the blood dripping from the soldier's temple, down his cheek, and onto the floor. Hallie's hands were ice as she gripped both sides of his face. "Slow and steady, in and out."
"These blokes behind the desk will wake soon." Yarrow's rough voice didn't help.
Hallie's right hand twitched. "He's having a panic attack, Mr. Yarrow."
"Then he'd best stop panicking soon."
"You've clearly never had one before," Hallie muttered. Her hands fell to Kase's. They were slick with a mixture of sweat and blood. "Listen to me, Kase. No one else. Breathe with me. In through your nose." She took a deep breath. "And out through your mouth." Kase obeyed, the freezing air burning in his lungs. Hallie's voice was soft. "Good. Now reach out with your mind. Feel the stone beneath your hands and knees. Ground yourself." The stone was cold. It was hard. It was rough. Immovable. The tightness in his chest that had been painful before loosened slightly. His lungs expanded, contracted. Hallie's hands left his. "Continue to breathe." A few more seconds and the nausea faded. Kase opened his eyes. Hallie's freckles stood out painfully on her cheeks. Her golden eyes were soft, her smile relieved. Yarrow trudged over and threw Kase's pack beside him. Kase took another deep breath and, with Hallie's help, stood. He rummaged through the pack and grabbed his own electropistol, stowing it in the back of his waistband. He could do this. They needed to get out of there. He tossed the pack on his shoulders. "I'm okay." His legs were a little shaky as they exited the holding cells, but he walked without assistance. Yarrow led them through the city. It was practically a ghost town with the storm and whatever had caused that orange glow. Nobody to see them escape. The first thing to go right. His heart still beat too fast. The cold rain mixed with the sweat coating his skin. Holy shucks. He shivered. What happened? A panic attack? It felt like what he'd experienced last autumn after the hover crash, except 1,000 times worse. How had Hallie known how to calm him down? He looked back at her. She was focused on their surroundings, eyes alert for anyone who might stop them from leaving the city. Over her head, an orange glow still raged. The rain hadn't dampened whatever fire had started. He whipped his head back around. The image of the bleeding soldier materialized in his mind, and the tightness in his chest returned. He stopped. A hand found his, and Hallie appeared on his left. She gave his hand a squeeze. Water dripped off her chin. Light from the gas street lamps made her pale skin shine. "You can do this." He didn't let go of her hand as they ran after Yarrow. They followed him through alleyways and the market square, where the raven on the inn's sign watched him with black eyes. Rain slid down sodden awnings and pooled in between the cobblestones. Water splashed onto Kase's boots. Yarrow took them down another street, and the final cottage at the edge of Nar loomed ahead. After that was nothing but trees. Almost there. "Halt!" The shout was guttural and nearly drowned out by a crack of thunder. Kase looked back to see soldiers, 3 of them. The one in the lead was the same captain from earlier. The captain unsheathed his electropistol and took aim. Hallie yelled as she tackled Kase. They fell. His shoulder slammed into the wet cobblestones, his pack keeping him from slamming his head as well. "Ow!" Hallie whimpered as she slid off him. He rolled to his stomach. The bolt zipped above them as another answered. Kase looked up. Yarrow stood with his 2 large coat billowing in the storm's wind, his hands before him clasping a pistol with blood on the grip. He dodged to the side and fired again. Kase yanked Hallie up with him, and they ran past Yarrow, who hit one of the soldiers with a bolt. The screams would haunt Kase's dreams. Getting hit with a bolt while soaked with rain might kill the man. It would have been you if Hallie hadn't pushed you out of the way. They made it into the trees, the rain letting up as the fir branches shielded them from the storm. Yarrow's labored breathing followed them. Hallie's mirrored his, scattered and shallow, but they couldn't stop now. He didn't know where they were going exactly, but he knew they needed to lose their tails, quickly, before his lungs gave out. He followed Hallie through the trees, and soon they stumbled upon a small cabin. Light flickered in the dirt-encrusted windows, and smoke puttered from the chimney, even in the rain. Warmth. Hallie pounded on the door, and after a few tense seconds, it opened to reveal a withered old man with a gap-toothed grin. Ossie Lermuth was a retired trapper who only allowed Hallie to store her effects in his cabin with the promise of moonshine from Yarrow. None of that made Kase feel any better, but he needed to get out of his wet clothing. Not that he would admit it out loud, but the soaked fabric had chafed in certain places. He hoped he'd hid his winces as they'd run through the woods. However, if they were leaving soon, the rain pouring outside would only drench whatever he changed into. Kase shrugged off his stolen jacket and set it in front of the fire, though far enough away as to not catch flame. Stupid thing wasn't like his leather pilot's jacket, as the shirt underneath was plastered to his skin. He peeled that off as well. Mother hadn't packed his pilot's jacket, and while Kase loved the feel and power the leather gave him, he hadn't fancied a run-in with his father to retrieve it. It wouldn't have ended well for either of them. The fire's heat warmed his bare skin. It drove away any lingering effects from the earlier panic attack. Some of the worry and fear melted from his shoulders. If he didn't look at the flames, he would be fine. "Good stars, you don't have to strip here," Hallie grumbled. Kase peeked over his shoulder. Her face was redder than her hair. She turned away, shivering. Goosebumps ran up Kase's back and down his arms. From the rain, of course. Finding a mostly dry shirt from his pack, Kase pulled it on. He'd deal with the discomfort his trousers created for a while longer, until he could have a little bit of privacy, even if his legs were screaming with frustration. Kase ignored it and dug out his crumpled trainee pilot's jacket. An envelope fluttered to the floor. His mother's writing graced the outside, the K having an extra flourish. He hadn't read it yet. He didn't know if he'd ever be able to, knowing he wouldn't ever see her again. His heart gave a painful throb, the goosebumps vanishing. Stuffing the envelope back in, he held up his trainee pilot's jacket to Hallie. "You can wear this if you don't want to change." "It's all right. I have something else in there, but I can wait." She glanced back and nodded to her own pack. Her cloak dripped onto the wooden slats. The water rolled down toward the front door and disappeared into the bare rug stretched before the fire. With a dim gas lantern on the leaning end table, Yarrow and Ossie continued to murmur in the corner, the latter eating soup that he hadn't offered to anyone else. Kase dropped clumsily to the floor, his muscles sore from their sprint, with his back to the fire as Hallie slipped off her cloak, leaving it in a sodden heap on the floor. She scooted next to him and encircled her knees, pressing her face into them. Her teeth chattered. Kase put his trainee jacket around her shoulders. "I don't need it." She pulled it tighter around her shoulders without looking up. "But thank you." "You're welcome." Kase brushed soaked dead foliage from his boots. "Care to tell me what happened?" Hallie pulled the jacket higher, burying her head further. "You don't want to know." "Hallie, tell me." "No." "Why not?" Yarrow laughed from the corner and took a puff from his newly lit pipe. He coughed as smoke spilled from his lips. "Blasted thing." He coughed some more before handing the pipe to the other trapper, who tapped the tobacco and set it next to the gas lantern. Yarrow continued, "She done exploded the airfield hangar. I didn't see it myself, but that's what some solly ran by shouting. Figured that was my signal to get your sorry bum out of that cell. Your girl got some intestinal fortitude." Kase cricked his neck, turning to look at Hallie. He rubbed the smarting muscle. "What in the blazes did you do?" "I put your flying lesson to good use." Her words were muffled. "Hallie?"
I might have possibly, or most definitely, I crashed your hover into the hangar. You crashed my... Hallie!
Kase's mouth fell open so fast his jaw popped.
What made you think that was a good idea? It was either that or have hovers on our tail when I broke you out.
She peeked up over the collar of the jacket.
Holy blasting stars! She's crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Except a part of him couldn't deny the seed of pride taking root. They'd rot together in a cell if the Jaydian military got a hold of them any time soon. Without hovers, the soldiers would be much slower chasing them through the pass. He shook his head.
And how did you manage to escape?
She hid her eyes once more.
Ejected just before I hit? My hover? Probably a hunk of melted metal.
Kase closed his eyes and chuckled. She'd faced her fear to save him.
You're a stars idiot, but I'm honored you committed a felony for me.
There wasn't anything they could do about it now, except make it into the pass and pray that no one connected Hallie to the crime. It was more likely they'd blame Kase somehow. Wouldn't hurt to add to his running list of crimes if he wasn't there to suffer for them, right? Pounding on the door interrupted his thoughts. Not with knuckles, something much harder, like the butt of an electropistol or the hilt of a military-issued sword.
"Open up in the name of the Stradat Lord Capitan!"
Hallie's head popped up as Kase lurched to his feet. Yarrow stumbled over to the bare rug and wrenched it aside, revealing a door beneath. It was flush with the wooden floor. He hooked his finger into a hole in the wood and lifted. Kase grabbed Hallie's hand and his sodden jacket before climbing down the ladder into the hole, not stopping to question it. All he knew was that whatever awaited them in the dark below was better than anything in Guyvena. Especially since Hallie had blown up the blasted hover hangar. Shocks and bolts. Hallie followed, and Yarrow threw down their packs before climbing down himself. They fell at Kase's feet, nearly bludgeoning Hallie's head, but she moved at just the right moment. The last thing Kase saw before Ossie closed the door and covered it with the rug was Hallie's too pale face. He dropped his jacket and pulled her to him. She clung to his shirt, her breathing irregular. Her wet clothes bled into his. So much for changing into a dry shirt.
Kase,
she whispered. He shook his head. He couldn't see much in the dim light slipping through the narrow spaces between boards where the rug ended. His body was rigid with anticipation, and Hallie's lithe form tucked up against him. He was tall, but the top of her head was even with his mouth, something that was rather distracting.
"I will kick this door in if you do not,"
the soldier shouted, but the door creaked open. Ossie coughed.
"By the moons, you don't need to bust my door in. It cost me a pretty copper, I'll have you know. I'd shined it up something fierce for weeks."
"We're looking for 3 people. 2 men, 1 woman, all wanted by the military,"
the soldier responded as he entered. His boots clicked loudly on the wooden slats.
"I heard voices."
Kase reached to where he still had his electropistol stowed in the back of his trousers. The memory of blood leaking from the soldier's temple flashed in his mind, but he shoved it away. If the choice was limited to shoot or be captured, well, he might have to get used to the feeling. Hallie tensed against his chest.
"Focus." "Aw," Ossie chuckled. "That's just me and old Gus, my feline. It's almost like he's human, you know. There was one time when he was little bitty, and I swear he told me he wanted his belly rubbed, and sure enough he did. Ha! Blasted stars."
Feline? Kase hadn't seen a cat. If there had been, Kase would have had a runny nose. He was rather allergic to them.
"Except I can see every corner of this room, and there's no cat in sight. However,"
the soldier's voice was hard. The bare rug dampened his footsteps as he strode further into the cabin. Shuffling followed. Ossie.
"Ah, Gus is always here. See, he's a-squatting there in the corner."
Was he mad? The soldier wasn't buying it either.
"This cloak, drenched, like it's been out in the rain recently."
Hallie gasped. Kase slapped a hand to her mouth.
"Blast."
No.
Ossie laughed too hard. He stomped his foot along with each chuckle.
I left it pour out on the stoop to dry from last evening, and would you know it started storming before I got to bring it in. Gus told me to set it there, said he'd fix it up for me tonight."
Hallie's lips were warm and soft against his palm. He removed it and wiped his hand on his damp trousers. The tingling didn't stop. Something plopped on the floor, probably the cloak. The soldier sighed.
"You'll be coming to the station for questioning, Ossie Lammoth. Yes, we know who you are."
"You serious?"
"As the stars."
Kase could hear the edge to the soldier's voice. If the unhinged trapper didn't follow orders, Kase knew all too well what they were capable of.
"Gus'll have to make do then, won't he? Until morning? I can't be a ways too long."
"I assure you your cat will be fine. If your story checks out, we'll return you at first light."
"I'll come along, as long as you don't hurt Gus."
"On my honor as a soldier in the Jaydian military."
No other words were exchanged, only footsteps, the sizzling of dying fire, and the slamming of the door filtered through the floorboards. Light between the cracks dimmed. Kase, Hallie, and Yarrow waited with bated breath for who knew how long. Kase's legs ached. Without the fire at his back, the chill settled in once more. Hallie shivered. Kase pulled her closer, but it didn't help. Finally, Yarrow spoke up.
"I think we're in the clear. Let's get a few hours' sleep, and then we'll let out before they get back."
His boots thumped on the ladder as he climbed, and flickering light shone through the hold as he opened the trap door. Kase followed. Yarrow grabbed the gas lantern and handed it to Kase.
"You both stay down there. Use the furs to keep you warm. Just don't drink that moonshine, Ossie would have my head if you did."
Kase's fingers gripped the lantern's handle. It was rough with age and slightly greasy. Hallie popped her head out of the hole. She had pulled her arms through the sleeves of the jacket. She shook her head. "The soldiers are looking for you, too. We should leave now." Kase strode over and handed her the lantern. "If we leave now, we'll run into patrols. It'll be easier to wait until we've had some rest and the initial search is over." She looked between Kase, Yarrow, and the trap door. Kase didn't fancy sleeping in a pit, but as they'd seen earlier, the soldier hadn't known it was there. She sighed. "All right, but don't be all heroic and sacrifice yourself, Mr. Yarrow. I still need you to get me through the pass."
"Of course, Miss Walker."
He went to the windows and pulled the filthy curtains closed before grabbing an iron poker and stoking the dying fire.
"I'll do my best if they come looking."
Kase nodded. "Good night, then. We'll leave before dawn." He followed Hallie down into the hole. Yarrow closed the door behind him. Now that a lantern lit the space, they could see it was rather small. To each side were shelves of dusty bottles holding opaque liquid. Moonshine. Past those were several pelts of various types hanging from the ceiling. At least they'd be warm. After creating two rather cushy pallets, he and Hallie settled in. The chill from earlier had abated thanks to the furs, but Kase still felt uneasy. So many terrible things had happened that day, things he'd surely be paying for later. At least he'd kept Hallie safe. That is, until he'd gotten himself arrested. And then she'd saved him at great personal sacrifice. Kase had very few people in his life who cared enough about him to do that. Warmth and a little bit of trepidation settled in his chest. He looked over as Hallie turned the gas lantern down, the cellar melting into near darkness.
"Yet you paraded that girl in front of the most important people on Yalvara tonight. What a blasting disgrace."
His father had never been more wrong, assuming Hallie was something beneath the Shackleys and Jayde high society. Kase hoped she found what she needed in Stonesit, and then settled down with someone who didn't have such a bloody history, someone who could take care of her without glancing over his shoulder for ghosts in the shadows. He swallowed the lump that had formed in his throat and whispered, "Thank you." For several seconds only silence answered back, before finally a rustling of fur met his ears. He could just make her out in the dull light filtering in through the cracks above. Her hair, still damp, clung to her right cheek. Even in the near darkness, her golden eyes shone bright. Hallie Walker was beautiful. How Kase could have ever thought he'd despised her was a mystery now. What a fool the Kase of last autumn had been. Hallie smiled.
Always. Good night, House. Night.
It was warm, and Hallie had saved him from certain death, and they were safe for now. Regardless, Kase fell into a fitful sleep. Chapter 22. Begrudging Loyalty. Jove. Jove hadn't slept in days. It wasn't just because he had a newborn, although waking with every cry and to check if Samuel was still breathing was surely contributing. The fight with his parents still haunted him. Jove worked so hard to keep his temper in check. He was too much like Harlan in that regard, and although it was perhaps justified, he'd lost control. He'd hit his father. Jove's fist still ached. He figured it was fractured, a just punishment for resorting to violence. He'd kept it wrapped the last few days, which helped the physical pain a little, better than what Harlan was facing. There was something else that bothered him. Kase had fled the capital, and the city wanted blood. Jove and Clara had been sequestered in Shackley Manor ever since the birth because of it. The most violent rioting was happening outside the inner wall. Even though Jove and Clara's townhouse was in the circle of the upper city, security at the manor would be much tighter. Just bearing the Shackley name made them a target. Clara's mother hadn't been able to get into Kaivenna because of the turmoil. Those wishing to enter the capital were required to have proper paperwork, and even then only on official government business. The birth of one's grandchild wasn't considered such, even if Jove's own mother had pleaded otherwise with the city guards. The gates to the upper city had also been closed. His father and High Guardswoman Hetty Coppin had been forced to pull soldiers and watchmen from nearby towns to Manitoul. The people wanted to see the Stradat Lord Capitan hang, Kase with him. It was a week after the fight that Jove was summoned to the Jayde Center. He left Clara and Samuel with kisses on their foreheads and a promise to return as soon as the business for the day was over, yet he hadn't told them what was happening. He'd expressly warned his mother not to say anything to his wife. There was no need to stress the already sleep-deprived Clara. She didn't need to know quite yet that Harlan was facing the High Council on charges of high treason. The trial would last nearly a week, though Jove was only needed for testimony the first day. He wouldn't be attending the others. This one day was enough. Jove's wife had always been reasonable, believing the best in people. If she'd known ahead of time what was happening that day, she might have pointed out that Harlan should get the chance to make penance, that he should be forgiven. Jove disagreed. He tugged at his tie as he rode to the Jayde Center, tapping his foot to an erratic beat. Harlan would expect his son to defend him. That's what Shackleys did. They protected each other and their reputations with everything they had. But Jove and his father thought differently on how one went about that. As he rode through the upper city, Jove took note of the combination of soldiers and watch patrolmen at every corner. No one expected unrest from the Jaydian elite, safe in their manors behind the upper gate. But the lower classes weren't the only ones who'd lost loved ones during the fire of the year 4497. The still absent Owen Christie, for example, had lost his entire family, save for his wife. It was only a matter of time. The wealthy class was merely waiting to hear the details of the day before deciding how they would react. The chauffeur Avery pulled the motor coach around the outside of Mackenzie Square, stopping in front of the stairs to the Jayde Center. Jove took several deep, fortifying breaths as the soldiers stationed outside came to the door, opening it for him. Sliding out of the coach, Jove stood, straightening his jacket and setting the bowler hat atop his head. Soldiers flanked him on each side as he climbed the stairs. After showing his identification papers to those at the door, he entered the Jayde Center and headed for the chamber where his father and the High Council awaited. The courtroom held benches along the outer walls and a dais in the center. Harlan sat straight-backed in one of the chairs before the dais. He was all alone. The Stradats, Loeffler, and Sarson, along with Hetty Coppin and several members of the city council, sat in the benches along the dark-stained paneled walls. Armed soldiers guided Jove to a seat next to Hetty, who gave him a tight nod. Her demeanor mirrored the others assembled. Once Jove was seated, sweat dripped down his face. It wasn't hot in the room. He slipped the bowler off his head and set it on his knee. He stared hard at his father, who in turn focused squarely on the floor in front of him. According to the medic, Harlan had experienced a minor heart attack the night Kase ran. He'd been prescribed bed rest, but considering his current situation, Jove doubted his father's heart was any better off than it had been. If anything, the chance of him having another over the course of the day was high. When the mechanical clock showed 9, Stradat Sarson rose from her chair. "Today, we, the remaining members of the Jaydian High Council, bring before you Stradat Lord Capitan Hallie Shackley. He is thereby accused of the high crimes of the obstruction of justice, an intent to conspiracy, and betraying the oath of office. Senior hover pilot Kase Shackley, though not present, is thereby accused of obstruction of justice, intent to conspiracy, reckless arson, and involuntary manslaughter. A warrant has been issued for his arrest. Today we will begin the proceedings regarding the Stradat Lord Capitan." Jove bent over, his head in his hands. The bandaging on his right knuckles scratched at his face, but he didn't care. All he could do was stare blankly at the marble beneath his feet. He barely listened to the rest of Sarson's remarks, the context for today's case. Jove knew it all. He prayed that he would get through the day without losing what little he'd eaten for breakfast. "The council recognizes Mr. Ellis Carrington of Kaivenna." Sarson's voice rang throughout the still chamber. Jove's head shot up as the doors to the chamber opened. A young man with blonde hair walked in, his head held high. Jove recognized him as one of Kase's friends from school. He didn't know him well, only that he came from a wealthy family. Ellis strode forward, guards flanking him, and took a seat on the opposite side of the dais from Jove's father. He was sworn under oath by the clerk by placing a hand over his heart. Sarson shuffled the parchment in front of her and eyed the witness. Jove could see through her calm mask. She was thrilled with the prospect of the Stradat Lord Capitan being convicted. Beside her, Loeffler looked positively bored. His drooping eyes were closed, and every few seconds his mustache billowed with an unseen wind. He'd fallen asleep. Figured. Sarson continued, fingering her scar as she spoke. "State your full name for the record and your relationships with the defendants." Ellis smoothed his pant legs as if trying to dry off sweaty palms. He looked at the various members of the Jaydian government seated in the benches surrounding him. "My name is Ellis William Carrington. I attended upper school with Kase Shackley." Jove picked at his nails. He didn't understand why someone friendly with Kase would be in here testifying against him and the Stradat Lord Capitan. Sarson and the judiciary members of the city council would have done their research appropriately. "And what information do you have regarding the fire of October 11, 4497? Sarson asked, tapping her finger on her parchment. Ellis Carrington looked directly at Sarson. Each word he spoke echoed off the chamber walls. "Kase Shackley confessed to starting the fire and used his father's position as Lord Capitan to cover up his crime." "And when did this confession come?" "On March 3rd, 4501. In Estelle's tavern in the lower city. We met up for dinner after he finished flight training for the day." Jove resisted the urge to hide his face in his hands. "Kase, you blasted stars idiot." Sarson wrote something on the parchment in front of her before asking, "And what was his confession exactly?" Ellis rubbed his pant legs again. Harlan still stared at the floor. Ellis's voice quivered slightly at his next words.
He said he set fire to a cottage in the lower city. He'd been smoking and wanted to see what...
Ellis pinched the bridge of his nose, emotion bleeding into his next words.
Wanted to see what would happen if he lit the roof on fire. He said he did it because he knew his father could get him off.
No. The word bubbled up from Jove's gut, and he leaped out of his chair. Objection! The entire room focused on Jove, including his father. Harlan didn't give any indication of his thoughts, but Jove felt the heat of his stare regardless. Sarson was the only one who hadn't turned to stare at him. Her voice was deadly calm when she retorted,
Denied. The council will allow your testimony after Mr. Ellis Carrington's concludes. Until that time, please hold your tongue, Lord Shackley.
Jove opened his mouth to say something else, but Hetty yanked him back down into his seat. She didn't look at him, only gripped his sleeve. Jove ground his teeth, but nodded. Thank you, Stradat Sarson. Hetty let go, and Sarson continued.
And what did you do with this information? I was scared. I didn't know what to do, because Kase is my friend. He trusted me. But I knew what he did was wrong, so on March 4th I went to the nearest watch station and told them what I knew. And you told no one else? Correct, Madam Stradat.
Sarson raised an eyebrow. The motion tugged on the scar that ran from her ear to the right corner of her lips.
Yet the capital city is in an uproar. The gates in the outer wall as well as the upper city are closed, manned by soldiers and watch agents. They all want the Stradat Lord Capitan and his son to hang. The rioting didn't begin until the night of March 4th. Who else did you tell?
Ellis swallowed visibly.
No one, Madame Stradat, I swear.
Stradat Sarson steepled her fingers in front of her. She took a moment, pressing them to her lips before sitting back.
So how did the information leak to the public? I don't know. Maybe someone overheard in the tavern?
Ellis had gone pale. He looked sickly in the electric light from the chandelier above.
I told Sergeant Powers at the Nile Street Precinct Station.
Sarson leaned forward on her elbows.
You're under oath, Mr. Carrington. I'll give you one last chance. How did the information leak to the public?
Ellis shook his head fitfully.
I don't know. I swear on Tovo's name. Please, you have to believe me. Except the exact, correct details have leaked to the public. If someone had overheard, the story would have been distorted with missing details. And yet, every other witness we have questioned has the same story. Maybe Sergeant Powers. All government agents are under strict orders to report to their uppers. Leaking any information is considered a betrayal of their oaths and punished severely.
Ellis's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. At that moment, Jove thought back to the missive, the one the Stradat Lord Capitan had received the night of Samuel's birth, of Kase's flight. Did the familiar handwriting belong to Ellis? Nevertheless, it didn't help the young man. In fact, it made him look worse. Sarson sat back and waved to the guards near the door.
Your testimony is complete. Privates Yastley and Green, please escort Mr. Carrington to the holding cells. We'll question him further at a different time.
Ellis shot up from his seat as the soldiers reached him.
You can't hold me against my will. On the contrary. Privates, please.
Ellis attempted to throw off the men, but he was quickly restrained. His protests only stopped once the doors closed behind him. Shock radiated throughout Jove's body. He'd been in this chamber many times, seen the exact thing happen more often than he could count. Yet this was different. This was about his family. Dread filled Jove's stomach like lead. Ellis Carrington knew something he refused to say, and Stradat Sarson had called him out on it. The man would be facing perjury charges, and possibly inciting a riot if Jode remembered his Jaydian criminal law correctly. But was Ellis Carrington acting on his own accord, oblivious to the repercussions of coming forward? Or was there someone else pulling the strings, and Ellis was simply caught up in their tangled web? It all came back to the missive. One World knew. Ellis had to be part of the group. Did whoever commanded the group send in the young man, knowing he'd be caught out? The shock rolled like ocean waves through his body. Holy stars! And if Ellis was dabbling in rebellion, what other wealthy elites had joined or contributed funds to the cause? Jove scanned the room. So many faces, so much money. If it could be Ellis Carrington, it could be anyone. His heartbeat was like a dagger stabbing against his ribs. It could be Kase. Except why would he run? Jove was so engrossed in his thoughts that he didn't hear his name being called until Hetty needled him with her elbow. Jove blinked and rubbed his arm. Stradat Sarson was looking straight at him. "Lord Jove Shackley, the council calls on you for testimony." His heart rate shot through the roof as he stood. Hetty caught him before he fell. She gave him a questioning look, but he shook his head. "Yes, Madame Stradat." Stars, Jove's hands were clammy as he made his way to the chair Ellis had vacated. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. His legs felt like rubber. Breathe. You've done this before. Just not at the expense of sending his father and brother to the gallows. Tell the truth. Sarson rearranged her parchment pages once more before the clerk came forward, stopping before Jove, one hand across his heart. Jove copied his posture and repeated the words that bound him to truth and the law of Jayde. "I swear to tell the truth in its entirety. I understand I shall be held accountable to the full extent of Jaydian law should I distort or omit the truth." His hand shook as he removed it from his heart and sat back down. Stradat Loeffler still snoozed in his chair. Stars, the commotion with Ellis Carrington hadn't woken him either. His moustache still rustled with each breath, so he wasn't dead. Stradat Sarson laced her fingers together, her eyes boring into Jove's. "State your full name for the record, and your relationships with the defendants." Jove willed his heart to slow as he took another deep breath. He forced his fingers to release their grip on the arms of his chair. "My name is Jove Hallie and Shackley. I'm the eldest son of the Stradat Lord Capitan. Kase is my brother." His voice was level and strong. He worked hard not to show the turmoil in his heart. It felt odd to say simply brother when for so long he'd been Jove's youngest one. Now there was only Kase. Sarson continued. "Would you say your family ties impede your judgment in the situation at hand?" Blasted woman. "By situation at hand, do you refer to the fire of October 11, 4497, in which I lost my youngest sister? Or are you referencing the events detailed by Mr. Ellis Carrington? My family ties pose no impediment to either." A few people shifted uneasily, but Jove's focus was on the scarred Stradat. She showed no reaction to his words, only answered his question. "Let us begin with Ellis Carrington's testimony of events. Were you aware of your brother's whereabouts the night of March 3, 4501? "No." "Why?" Jove ran his tongue across his teeth. He'd been dealing with the residual effects of consuming too much alcohol the previous night, and had no clue where Kase had been. "My brother does not live with me, nor am I his keeper." "And did your brother tell you about his confession in the tavern?" "No." She continued to use the word brother as if she were trying to rub salt in the wound that he no longer had more than one. "When did you last see your brother?" Jove closed his eyes for a second. Peppering him with rapid-fire questions was her way of getting him to slip up. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "The night of March 2nd, 4501, at the state dinner celebrating the Rubicon Alliance." Sarson wrote something down. A few whispers of those assembled met his ears, but the Stradat looked back at Jove. "So you cannot confirm or deny your brother confessed his crime to Ellis Carrington on the night of March 3rd, 4501?
I cannot confirm or deny where my brother was on March 3rd, 4501.
And how would you describe your relationship with your father?
Jove blinked. All eyes were on him. His palms were slick, but he didn't dry them. Body language was how Sarson had caught Ellis Carrington in a possible lie. Jove had seen her use the tactics before. He looked her square in the eye.
We have our differences.
Differences?
Jove sat back, crossing his right ankle over his left knee, projecting confidence he didn't feel.
Respectfully, all you need to know is that Hallie and Shackley and I rarely see eye to eye.
Except it could make every difference in the world for you.
Jove shook his head.
It doesn't.
Then pray, how should the council know your family relations aren't impeding your testimony or judgment of the events being examined today?
Jove planted both feet on the ground, his hands on the arms of his chair.
Because my duty is to my country and its citizens first.
The memory of his son floated to the top of his mind, of Clara singing him to sleep the previous evening.
You can do this.
Sarson set her pen down, lacing her fingers together.
Then tell us in detail what you were doing the night of October 11, 4497.
Jove's stomach hardened. He knew this question was coming. That didn't mean he was prepared for it. He took a deep breath.
At the time, I was a watch captain of the upper quarter. I was finishing my shift when my brother, Zeke Shackley—
Your deceased brother?
Jove clenched his jaw. He would not lose it here.
Yes.
Please continue.
Blasted Helvetor.
He smoothed a hand across his stubble to quell his nerves. Sweat left a cold trail across his cheek. He sat up straighter.
Zeke sent me a missive stating that Kase and Anna were planning on running away. He'd received a note from our sister Anna. He asked if I could go to the manor and stop Kase. He would try and find Anna.
Jove closed his eyes again. They burned. Zeke hadn't found her in time.
Why would they want to run away?
Jove hesitated. Did it matter?
My father.
Murmurs broke out in the room. Stradat Sarson waited a minute for the conversations to die down before pinning Jove with her stare.
How so?
Jove refused to look at Harlan.
Kase wanted to attend university after he finished upper school that coming spring, but our father wouldn't allow it. He believed Kase would benefit from the discipline the military offered. For Anna, she was betrothed against her wishes to Lord Morgan's son. He swallowed. I found Kase and my father at the manor. They were arguing. It turned violent.
Violent how?
Jove's hands shook. His breathing grew heavier. A phantom pain spread across his forearm where his father had fractured it by shoving him against the desk. Jove had jumped in to save Kase. All Jove had seen in that moment was the little boy, his brother, asking to be like Jove one day. Kase coming to Jove when he'd hurt himself falling out of the tree because their current governess frowned upon such horseplay.
Lord Shackley, please answer the question.
Jove shivered, still looking at the floor in front of him. He took a shaking breath and tilted his head up to meet Stradat Sarson's gaze.
Kase suffered a broken rib, a fractured eye socket. I stepped in, Kase ran. My father had beaten my brother.
Gasps and shouts erupted across the room. The lights flickered. Stradat Loeffler woke with a great snort before falling back asleep once more. Stradat Sarson had to raise her voice to regain control. Jove choked as the words, the secrets, tumbled from his lips in front of every major player in Kaivenna. He was a weak and terrified little boy once more, not one of the most powerful bureaucrats in all of Jayde. Kase ran as far as he could until he couldn't. A stray cigarette started the fire. It was an accident. Stradat Sarson's words were quiet, as if she cared.
And were you aware of your father's dealings behind the scenes to keep Kase from being punished by the council?
Harlan met his eyes. They weren't cold, only void of emotion. Jove didn't know which was better. He looked back at Stradat Sarson. Her scar seemed to mock him, already knowing the answer he'd give. Yes. You violated your own oath of office by allowing your father to lie to the high and city councils? Jove hadn't realized he'd started crying, the tears falling down his cheeks and onto the collar of his jacket. He thought of Clara, of Samuel, of how he hated his father with every fiber of his being. He clamped his hands on his knees, doing anything to stem the emotions pouring out of him. I do not regret protecting Kase. He did nothing deserving of this. It was an accident that killed our sister and so many others. He's paid dearly for his sins. However, I accept my role in this. But I will not make excuses for the Stradat Lord Capitan. He doesn't deserve my begrudging loyalty any longer. Sweat and tears dripped to the floor of the dais as Jove leaned forward. He was done. He couldn't do anything more. He'd told the truth. Thank you, Lord Shackley. You may take your seat, Sarson said, her voice quiet. With legs of lead, Jove stood and walked back to his seat, falling onto the bench beside Hetty. The absolute silence of the chamber clamored in his ears. He'd done what was asked of him. He'd done his best to save Kase, but it wasn't going to be enough. He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes until he saw amorphous shapes. With his confession, he'd probably be called in later to face his own charges. Stradat Sarson cleared her throat and tapped her papers together. The council will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 to hear further evidence. She banged her gavel. They led his father away, the soldiers he'd trained flanking him. The chamber buzzed with questions, accusations, and rumors. It wasn't until someone laid a hand on Jove's shoulder that he finally looked up. Hetty Coppin stood above him, her grey hair refusing to stay in a proper lady's bun. Her spectacles were tucked into the outer pocket of her watch uniform. Let's get you home. He followed her out of the chamber and into the afternoon sun. Chapter 23. A Glutton for Punishment. Kase. The only sounds for hours had been the crunching of snow beneath their boots and Yarrow's labored breathing. Kase's muscles already ached from the ordeal the previous day, and the hike into the Nardens only made it worse. He'd been there before, last autumn, but he'd been in a hover without freezing rain pelting his face. His boots kept out most of the rain and snow, but his socks hadn't fully dried from the night before. The tingling on his left heel had morphed into stinging, a blister. To say Kase was miserable was an understatement. He'd lost track of time. The sky grew darker as the road rose even more, weaving back and forth like a snake. The cobblestone was miles behind them now, replaced by rocky dirt, and tall, overarching trees crowded both sides. The evergreen branches above cracked under the weight of ice. Above the trees, rocky spires towered like menacing guards, piercing the murky sky. The snow fell faster and began to gust when Yarrow paused, looking back. He'd fashioned a fallen limb into a walking stick soon after they'd left Aussie's cabin. He leaned against it, his nose a berry pink, and eyes sparkling like the ice lining his thick coat. Kase shivered and willed the ache in his fingers to disappear. Yarrow gestured to the sky with his free hand. Should probably stop for the night. Kase folded his arms, ducking his face behind his collar. He wished he'd bought a thick scarf in Nar. At least he had his wool cap. Where? Hallie asked, her teeth chattering. Kase barely heard her over the wind picking up. We can't weather a blizzard out here under a tree. We're out a mile from a hut. Kase's voice shook. Hut? Hallie looked back at him. She had pulled the hood of her new fur-lined cloak up around her face, It had dried out decently in front of Ossie's fire the night before. The dark material and the cold made her skin appear even paler.
Yarrow knows the pass and where the trappers' huts are. Niels's brother had one on the other side, closer to Stonesit.
Niels? Something like pain flashed in Hallie's eyes. Kase didn't like the twisted feeling in his gut when Hallie looked away. What wasn't she telling him? Yarrow coughed. The lass is right. I'm worth every copper. We paid you in gold, Kase said, tearing his gaze from Hallie. That you did. With that, Yarrow was off. Hallie followed, still refusing to look at Kase. He chewed the inside of his cheek as he walked. Why should he care so much about a passing comment? Hallie had a life before Kase ever came into the picture. He had his own past he wanted to hide. In fact, it was his sole reason for leaving Kaivenna. Hallie needing a hover ride was merely a convenient excuse. Besides, it wasn't as if there was anything more than friendship between him and Hallie. She didn't owe him an explanation. Then why couldn't he stop thinking about it? After a good way in silence, Hallie slowed to walk beside him. She tugged her cloak closer around her shoulders.
People used to visit Stonesit just for the mountains. Sometimes they'd stop on their way to Fort Achilles for a day or so. It's rather beautiful, despite the fact my eyelashes have turned to ice.
Kase pulled his cap down further as a large clump of snow landed on Hallie's pack. I don't think I'd mind living up in the mountains if I could bring all my books with me. I'd live in a little cabin with no one to bother me.
All by yourself?
Hallie's soft laugh was barely audible over the wind as she shook the snow off.
Living in the city has so many more perks.
Like people blocking up every blasting street? Hallie ignored him.
For one, Kaivenna has the best food. And two, there's so much more to do, like going to the theaters. Growing up, my brother, Niels, and I entertained inn guests with our own little plays. Not nearly as grand.
Niels is a friend? She looked down at her boots as they lagged behind Yarrow.
He was Jack's best friend. And, well...
And what? It was the way she'd said his name, like it was some sort of secret. She was facing away from him, examining the dark hollows between the tree trunks as they passed. Kase cleared his throat. So, you used to put on plays for the inn's guests? Did you make people's ears bleed with your stars' awful voices? Hallie hit him lightly on the arm, knocking off a bit of snow and ice. Good, back to normal.
Yes, we did, but Jack always took the best parts, blasted dull cop. I always wanted to be Odysseus, but, alas, he refused to give up the role.
He sounds a little like Jove, Kase said with a small laugh. Hallie was silent for a moment too long.
I miss him.
Sorry, I didn't mean to bring it up. Hallie shook her head.
I'm fine most of the time, but then all of a sudden...
Yeah, I know what you mean. Kase understood that feeling all too well. It was one of the things that bound him and Hallie together. He was glad of that, terrible as it sounded, though he would have traded it to get Anna and Zeke back in a heartbeat, and he knew she would do the same for her brother. Without warning, the wind picked up, whipping the cap off Kase's head. He lunged for it, barely catching it by a flap, but another gust nearly knocked him over.
What in the blazes?
Yarrow stumbled toward them. We're almost there, but the blizzard ain't waiting. He held out his free hand to Hallie. Hold on tight. Hallie grasped it and turned to Kase. Her gloved fingers were clumsy in Kase's as he grabbed her other hand. What had been an uncomfortable weather seconds before was a raging storm now. He ducked his head further into his jacket, the other hand pressing his hat down. Relief flooded Kase's body, bringing a little bit of warmth to his frozen extremities as they reached a dark structure peeking out between drifts of snow. The hut. Kase could barely stand straight as Yarrow tried the door. It didn't budge. He beat it with his stick, which broke. Blast it, the lock's frozen solid. Even over the wind stinging his ears, Kase heard the fear lacing his voice. He shook his head. Let me try. He let go of Hallie's hand and stumbled forward. The handle was indeed frozen. He peeked at the frame. It opened inward. Luck at last. He handed over his pack to Hallie. Stand back. Yarrow moved to stand beside Hallie as Kase squared up in front of the door. He picked up his foot and placed it beside the handle where the locking mechanism should be. Okay, here we go. He stepped back, trying to ignore the ache in his bones. He had to be sure to not kick the handle, and a twisted or broken ankle would spell disaster. Yarrow would leave him behind. Steeling himself, his eyes narrowed in concentration, Kase drove his heel into the door with as much force as he could muster. Crash! The door flew open, exposing a shadowy interior. Yarrow harumphed and strode forward. Not too bad. Come on. Kase took his pack from Hallie, and they scurried in. He closed the door behind them, but it wouldn't stay completely shut. That's what I get for kicking it in, I guess. He set his pack in front of it. Hallie and Yarrow added theirs to the pile. You happen to bring a lantern, City Slicker? Yarrow asked. Kase could barely see. There was only one dirty window, and the darkening skies blocked most of the dying sunlight. He squinted at the outlines that were Hallie and Yarrow. No, but I do have... He rummaged in his pack. When his hand felt the cool metal of the electro-pistol, he pulled it out and lit up the muzzle with sparks, pointing it away from the others. It'll work until we get a fire going. Hallie's face flickered with shadows as she edged closer. Just don't pull the trigger. Kase rolled his eyes, but handed it to her, muzzle pointed down. I'm not an idiot. Yarrow laughed. Kase bit back a retort. He owed the man his life for breaking him out of the holding cells. Hallie took the pistol and turned, using the sparks to search the cabin. Kase dug out a second pistol and inspected the other side. There was a small bed, but Kase thought it might fall apart just looking at it. He also tripped over a small stack of firewood. Found some bread. More mold than bread, Hallie grunted from her side. Yarrow lowered himself onto the bed. I don't eat mold. Ignoring him, Kase picked up a few of the logs he'd tripped on. These should last us until morning. Hallie came up beside him and nodded. Put them in the grate there, and I'll grab the flint. My task for the day is done, Yarrow said, easing himself onto the bed, scarf still wrapped around his neck. When you make food, I'll eat it. Otherwise, don't bother me. Whatever, Kase mumbled. Blasted old man. Kase shivered as he trudged over to the fireplace. It was like his bones had turned to ice. His fingers were numb and shook as he laid the wood in what he thought was a good formation. It resembled a pyramid, each piece stacked like a brick. A second or two later, a cloak fell around his shoulders. He looked up to see the outline of Hallie's face in the poor light. He smiled. Thanks. She inspected the wood. What are you doing? Stacking the wood? Yarrow snored in response. Hallie bent down, shaking her head, and took the log from his hands. The fire has to breathe a little. I thought fire building would be a standard practice for military training. Well, as pilot training was a bit of a joke, Kase said, sitting back and pulling the borrowed cloak around him. I never learned how to build a proper fire. One of the reasons. Hallie rearranged the stack into a cone structure, the tops of the logs meeting at the top. She grabbed the flint from her pack and turned to Kase. If I remember correctly, you didn't start any of the fires on our mission last fall, either. Don't know how. I guess you've had servants to light them for you? Your point? Nothing. Will you hold the electropistol, then? I would rather light this paper I found in the cabinet, not my cloak. Kase grabbed the pistol from her and held it where she could see. Once she had a spark catch and smoke, she leaned down further and blew. Kase uncocked the electropistol. When the flames finally began to consume a larger piece of wood, Hallie sat back and dusted off her hands. We'll need to add more as the night goes. Whoever's on watch can handle that. She looked over at the still snoring Yarrow. My guess is it'll be one of us. I don't think anyone's stupid enough to be out in this storm, or in the past for that matter. Kase set the pistol beside his pack. Hallie shrugged. Only us, then. Huh, right. How about some dinner? Didn't you say you picked up some sort of meat before you got arrested? After the fire was hot enough, Hallie roasted little sausages with a frying pan-like spit she'd found in the cabinets. They ate that with a glob of cheese. They tried to wake Yarrow as requested, but he cursed Kase and turned over. A few links were saved only at Hallie's request. Kase wanted to throw them at the old trapper. Finishing his portion, Kase leaned back on his hands, the fire warming his back. Looks like you're getting better at cooking. Hallie rolled her eyes and wiped her fingers on her trousers. It was a team effort, I'd say. Kase laughed. I wish we could eat more, but I know we need to be prepared in case it takes us longer to get out of here. Yeah, Hallie said softly, her arms sliding around her knees and hugging them to her chest. Kase fiddled with the edge of his jacket for a moment. Care to tell me what we're doing out here? Hallie's eyes looked almost like molten gold in the firelight. Seeing if my parents are okay isn't good enough? That's not what I meant, Kase muttered. The howling wind and rattling door drowned out Kase's sigh. Fine, if she didn't want to talk, she didn't want to talk. He turned toward the fire. Kase needed to escape the city, but he still didn't understand Hallie's motivations. Checking on her parents made sense, but there was something else she didn't want to tell him. They sat in silence, ignoring the wind and snow pelting the window. The fire crackled happily in its grate, and Kase watched the shadows flickering on the front wall of the little hut. How could something so incredibly destructive also be so comforting? What was that saying? Too much of a good thing? I'm going to sleep. Hallie moved and grabbed her bedroll from her pack. Kase jumped. The flames had teased him into a trance, and all he could see were those tongues climbing higher and higher over the rooftops of Lower Kaivenna. He shook his head. Too bad Yarrow took the only bed. I'd have let you have it. I didn't think you had such good manners, Lord Pilot. Very funny, Miss Walker. Kase stood and stretched, his cloak falling to the side. I couldn't sleep in good conscience with you on the floor, but as our esteemed guide has taken it, we're stuck down here. Hallie spread out her roll, her head nearest the fire, and climbed in. Kase pulled his out and settled a few feet away, using the cloak as a pillow. Hallie said, 6 months ago you would have taken the bed without any hesitation. Kicked Yarrow out of it, too. Kase laughed. It felt nice. I was such a dull cop. Sorry. Are you sure you want to sleep down here? She shook her head. I'm fine. What if we push him off the bed and both sleep in it? Even in the dim firelight, Kase could see the red blush spreading over her cheeks, and he chuckled. Hallie scowled. Good night. Come on, I was teasing. In response, Hallie pulled the top part of the sleeping roll over her head. Kase heaved an annoyed sigh and tucked his own over his shoulder. He faced Yarrow's slumbering form. Can't take a joke for moon's sake. After a while, the blizzard died down to a whisper. Even so, his mind wouldn't let him rest, choosing to replay his worst memories. He saw Zeke's chest jerk again and again, heard Erevan's words as he laid out the plan to blackmail Kase and take Hallie. Felt the soldier go limp after he hit him in the head with the pistol. Kase? He rolled over. Hallie's eyes were visible over the lip of the cloak she'd laid on top of her bedroll. He hadn't even heard her move to grab it. Yeah? I'm sorry about all this. Kase pushed himself up on his left elbow. I don't think you can take credit for the blizzard. Hallie pulled herself up, the cloak pooling at her waist, and turned to face him. No, I mean, for dragging you out here. Maybe it was stupid, especially now my face will be joining yours on a wanted poster. You didn't force me to do anything. Kase yawned and rubbed a hand over his eyes. In fact, my drunken memories tell me I practically begged you.
Still, though, thank you.
You're welcome. Then he remembered what else he'd grabbed in Nar. He got up and rummaged through his pack until his fingers found the rough edges of the paper sack. Hallie leaned forward.
What is that?
Kase fished out a wrapped caramel chew and tossed it to her. She caught it with deft fingers and grinned.
I'd forgotten you'd bought these.
I thought another reckless journey called for some caramels. Hallie unwrapped hers and popped it into her mouth with a soft groan.
Agreed.
Kase took one for himself and threw it up in the air. With an adept movement, he caught it and chewed. The buttery, sugary goodness spread across his tongue like wildfire. Hallie laughed.
Bravo! You've practiced.
Kase swallowed and chuckled. Obviously. He set the bag in the middle, and they both had another. You sure you won't tell me the other reason we're out here? Hallie sucked her teeth and played with the candy wrapper, the crinkling competing with the crackling fire.
The caramels were a way to butter me up.
Possibly, but they're also simply delicious. Hallie's eyes were hard as she stared at him. She broke eye contact first, looking down at her fingers and biting her lip.
You've risked a lot to get me here.
Kase stayed silent. He didn't want to break the small bit of trust he'd just earned.
I'd always wondered about the Yalvs, ever since the stones at schoolmistress brought them up,
Hallie said.
When Jack died and I got to go to university, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to study them. The more I learned, the more curious I became.
She looked back at the fire, her voice soft.
And then, after I opened the door, I had to ask Pa. I had to know.
What do you mean, opened the door? She fiddled with the wrapper.
Do you not remember how I used my own blood to open the door to the gate chamber?
The memory flashed in his mind. He'd remembered some of it the night of the estate dinner when the Rubicon ambassador had commented on Hallie's eyes.
I can only remember bits and pieces. But I wish you'd stop beating around the bush. Just tell me already. It hurts my head to think too hard.
Hallie looked like she wanted to stick in a quip by the way her eyes brightened, but she caught herself and shook her head.
My blood opened the door because, well, I'm Yalvin.
Yarrow grunted in his sleep. Hallie and Kase jumped. When the trapper didn't stir any more, only breathed deeply, Kase turned back to her.
What? Hallie was Yalvin? Holy moons!
He racked his brain again.
How? You don't look anything like... Blasted, your eyes! That's why the Rubicon...
Oh, shucks.
Yes. And why didn't you mention this little nugget earlier, like the time the Yalvs captured us and tied us up? Don't you think your supposed lineage would have helped there?
Hallie crushed a wrapper in her hand.
I didn't know for sure. I had found a Yalvin portrait tucked away in our inn's attic years ago, and when I asked Papa about it, he forbade me from snooping. I didn't listen, but I couldn't find anything other than a locked chest. Even Jack couldn't jimmy it open. You saw a portrait, and that means you're Yalvin? I thought you were some sort of scholar.
Hallie stood, her sleeping roll falling away, and paced in the small space before the fire crackling in the hearth.
The woman in the picture looked like Salder, like the Lord Elder, like every other Yalv we met in Mirai.
But that wouldn't necessarily mean you're Yalvin.
We needed to get into the chamber. I acted on instinct and hoped for the best.
Kase ran both hands through his hair and cradled his head in them.
And why does this matter now? It matters because, well, I think that portrait is more than someone my great-grandmother painted, which is the story Papa told me. What if she was someone I'm related to? So yes, I do want to know if my parents are okay, but I need to know about the other stuff, too. Okay, so you're Yalvan. Again, why does it matter? I have to know. What in the stars was she going on about? Kase rubbed his eyes. Why? I don't care if you're Yalvan or a blasted dragon. Hallie stopped her pacing and sat. She pulled her knees to her chest. The fire lit one side of her face. I need to know what I am, who I am, because I don't know anymore. Ever since the mission to Mirai, I feel like I'm living some sort of lie. A pang throbbed in Kase's chest. He knew exactly what she felt. Their first meeting in that dusty bookshop replayed in his head. How could he not have known then that the girl who'd insulted him with a line from Romeo and Juliet would be so much like himself? Why had he taken so long to realize that? He reached across the short distance and grabbed her hand, slipping a caramel inside. He didn't let go. You're Hallie Walker, Kase whispered, giving her hand a soft squeeze. Intelligent, spirited, and stubborn as the stars. None of the rest matters. Hallie's eyes were wet as she looked at him, and Kase's chest lurched again. Stars, this girl. Thank you. Hallie pulled her hand from his and wiped her eyes. She unwrapped the caramel. Your turn. Why'd you come if you thought it was pointless at first? Kase ran a hand through his hair. It didn't matter whether I stayed in Kaivenna or not. Either way, I'd be in deep trouble. Is that why you keep alluding to the fact you aren't returning? Kase tossed the empty candy wrappers into the fire. They popped and fizzled as they caught, though not so easily as a thatched cottage roof. There was this thing. It's a long story, and one I'm not ready to tell yet. I left because I don't want to drag my family into it. Well, Jove and my mother, that is. This way it takes the pressure off them. I had no choice but to leave the city. Hallie leaned in and took his hand. She didn't say anything, just held it, the heat from the flames mixing with the feeling of her fingers laced in his. She looked up into his eyes. Thank you. Yeah, and I guess I couldn't pass up an adventure, even if the last one ended badly. Kase smiled, his heart in his throat. Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment. Hallie's laugh was pure and simple as she took her hand away. You and me both. She paused, looking back at the fire. We should get some sleep. Yarrow can't be the only one awake enough to traverse the pass in the morning. Kase nodded as she scrunched herself back down into her sleeping roll. He followed suit, pulling the material tight around him. After a while, Hallie's breaths were slow and deep. Kase's own eyelids grew heavy, and before sleep claimed him, Hallie's eyes danced into his mind. They look like honey. I like honey. Chapter 24. You're Gonna Sink. Hallie. After 2 days of trekking through the pass and staying in cabins only Yarrow could find, the last one being hidden behind a rather large outcropping, Hallie was grateful they'd picked up more clothing in Nar. The extra gloves and socks worked wonders, but as the 3rd day wore on, snow fell once more. The sky didn't look as dark as it had with the blizzard, but if they didn't find another hut, they might as well dig themselves an icy grave. Snowpacks overhead watched their every move. As long as they moved quickly and avoided doing anything to dislodge the latter, they should survive the pass. Maybe. Thankfully, they began their descent as the tree line grew closer. Under the safety of the trees, walking might be a little easier the further they went. If she remembered correctly, they should be within a day or so from Stonesit. Mr. Yarrow? His name became several syllables with the trembling in her shoulders.
He turned, his cheeks bright red with the cold.
Are we close to stopping for the night?
Kase stood beside her, his own body quivering from the cold. His fur cap was frosted with flakes.
If I don't sit by a fire soon, I'm going to be turning into one of those blasted ice sculptures.
Hallie shook her head, nose running. She swiped at it with her wet gloves, leaving a scratchy feeling on her upper lip.
This was a horrible idea, wasn't it?
Yarrow leaned on his broken stick.
I never said it was easy. We have quite a ways till we stop.
Could we rest under the trees?
Kase gestured with his hands to Yarrow's pack.
We have a bit of firewood.
The trapper spit into the snow.
A fire that'll blow out with the wind and...
Blue fire zinged through the air and nailed the trapper's shoulder. Hallie screamed as Kase dove for her. The snow cushioned them, but Kase was blasted heavy. Blue fire? Searles! They were here, but how?
Stars. Stones it.
Kase held her as more bullets flew above them. He rolled off and fumbled through his pockets for his electro-pistol. Hallie grabbed it from the back of his trousers and shoved it into his hands. Shoot! He fired blindly in the direction the bullets came from. Hallie scrambled to her feet. If she could get to the tree line, she could find her own electro-pistol tucked away in her pack and help. She stumbled toward the trees, not looking back. Kase followed, firing twice over his shoulder. Once they made it to cover, he turned. 2 people were up on rocky ledges, hidden behind outcroppings. Hallie dropped her pack and rummaged through it. Kase kept firing. A shout followed as Kase ducked behind a tree. "Get up!" He jerked her up as a trio of fiery blue bullets hit her pack. The thing exploded. Hallie clung to Kase. Even through his many layers, she felt the pounding in his heart. It mirrored hers. Kase released her and leaned out from behind the tree, firing his electro-pistol 3 times in rapid succession as blue fire arched above them. They ducked as a branch fell directly on her back.
"Got him,"
Kase breathed as he stepped out from behind the tree. Hallie fell beside her destroyed pack. Her extra clothing, their food, all blasted to shreds. She had a few things tucked away in her satchel, but how was Frankenstein and the telegram her parents sent going to help? Kase stumbled over to Yarrow, who hadn't moved. His blood coated the snow.
"No."
Kase looked back at her.
"He's alive, but—"
He grunted as he lifted the large man up. Yarrow groaned.
"Leave me, Slicker. It's what I deserve."
Hallie ducked under the trapper's other arm.
"It'll be all right. We've got you."
Another whizzing sound erupted from the direction of the Searles. Hallie caught the blue light in the corner of her eye as it hit Kase's leg. He screamed as he fell, electro-pistol flying from his hand and Yarrow toppling with him. Hallie hit the ground, scrambling for the weapon. Her hands were stiff with the cold, but she grasped the pistol and fired in the direction the bullet had come from. Had there been another Searle in the trees?
Oh, stars, oh, stars!
Yarrow pulled himself up and yanked the weapon from her grip. Red blood gushed from his shoulder. His breathing was shallow and labored, but he fired in the direction of the Searles.
"Take him, lass. I'll lead them off."
"But
go!"
Kase sucked in a breath as Hallie grabbed his arm and hauled him up as best she could. He leaned heavily on her as they made for the trees. Unnatural with the pistol, Yarrow fired relentlessly at the ledges, limping toward where blue fire answered his taunts. His right arm dangled, blood dripping onto the snow with each step. Hallie turned away. She didn't want to see Yarrow die. Kase moaned once they'd reached cover.
"I don't think I can make it much further. We're too far from Stonesit."
Hallie's eyes stung as tears leapt to them.
"I don't think... Oh, blasted stars, don't you go dying on me now."
He grimaced.
"Didn't say I was dying."
She looked behind them at the trail of speckled blood on the disturbed snow.
"Let me see your leg."
He winced as she sat him down underneath the boughs of a nearby tree. The small area was mostly clear of snow. He loosened his boot and lifted the hem of his pants.
"Grazed me. Still hurts like a demon."
Blood leaked from his calf, not gushing, but enough to be a problem. She eased his pack off his back and rifled through it for something to use as a bandage.
We need to get help before it gets infected.
She found a sock, wadded it up, and pressed it to the wound. The gash wasn't too deep.
Hold this. I'm going to look for Yarrow.
Kase grabbed her arm, preventing her from rising.
He'll find us if he's alive, but if not, I don't want you out there if the cells are still hunting. Except the blood trail you left will lead anyone right to us.
Then we'd better find a stars-blasted good hiding place. Grimacing, he stretched the sock and tied it around his calf with gloved fingers. Hallie helped him lace his boot. Kase grunted as he used the tree to help himself stand.
Let's get out of here.
Hallie bit her lip to keep herself from saying something that would only make the situation worse. She wanted to help Yarrow, but she was powerless. He'd sacrificed himself just to save them. Just like Zeke. And Ebba.
Skinny through!
Hallie's head snapped around and she froze. A man appeared from behind a rock, an enormous weapon on his shoulder. A cannon, like the one that had destroyed the forest near the Eudora Jayde.
No, no, no!
Hallie tugged on Kase's pack, making him wobble. He caught himself on her shoulder and cursed as he followed her line of sight. Ethereal blue smoke leaked from the cannon's barrel, the plume growing. Hallie and Kase staggered away. They couldn't outrun that cannon. Hallie could only cling to Kase as the resounding boom pierced the frigid air. The entire mountain shook. Hallie stumbled, Kase with her. She caught herself on a nearby tree. A rumble, low at first, but gradually increasing in volume. She looked up at the mountainside. The cannon fire had hit the snowpack. Snow slid from the cliff face. The Cerul hadn't hit her and Kase for a reason. It meant to start an avalanche.
Climb!
Kase didn't question her. He grabbed a jutting branch from the nearest trunk and scrambled up, hissing in pain. The rumbling grew louder as Hallie followed.
Stars! Stars!
Blood smeared against the tree where Kase's leg brushed against it. Hallie didn't care. Growing up in the mountains had taught her many things. First, don't play too close to the mountainside. Second, if you're caught in an avalanche, it's too late. Climbing a tree might mean their deaths, but it was the only thing she could think of in that moment. Her father's voice rang in her ears as the snow grew louder.
Try to stay on top, but you're gonna sink. Create breathing room and pray someone finds you soon.
The snow barreled into their tree. It shook and swayed. Hallie lost her grip. She scrambled for purchase. Kase yelled something, but she couldn't hear it as the snow caught her ankle and ripped her from the tree.
Swim towards the source.
Her arms flailed. The snow was icy hot against the exposed skin of her face and neck. The roaring in her ears drowned out anything and everything until she slowed to a stop, her arms flung in front of her face. It was dark and too quiet, a contrast from when she couldn't hear herself think moments before. She had little time before the snow solidified. She took the deepest, largest breath she'd ever breathed and held it. She had yet to open her eyes. Cold seeped into her very being. She clawed at the surface above her, praying she wasn't the wrong way up. Seconds ticked by as her fingers grew weaker. Had she come all this way, blown up a hover hanger and survived most of the pass, only to die here in the snow? She took small, shallow breaths as nausea crept into her stomach. What if no one ever found her? What would Kase think? Was he even alive? Would her blue body thaw out with the spring? The seconds ticked by. Tears trailed down her cheek like icy rivulets. Had Jack felt like this in the seconds before he died? He'd been buried by stone instead of snow. It had been quick. Hallie would suffocate slowly. She let out a sob.
Hallie!
The voice was faint and muffled, but she heard it. Her heart skipped. Kase. She knew enough not to shout yet, only pawed at the snow above her. It was getting more and more difficult to do so, like trying to break through a rock. Her numb fingers were soaked in the gloves, but she nearly cried when her fingers met the open air. She prayed it wasn't some random air pocket, that it was indeed the outside. She opened her eyes at last. Light filtered in around her extended arm.
Here! I'm here!
Hallie! She waved her hand, creating a slightly larger hole.
Kase!
The light darkened above her. Kase's breathless voice answered. I'll dig you out! Hold on! Scraping and chipping followed while she waited. She took breaths of fresh air streaming in through the hole, more tears cascading down her frozen face. She'd survived, gotten incredibly lucky to be that close to the surface after being pulled out of the tree. Her limbs started quaking. It's okay, Kase said, still hacking away at the snow above her. I'm getting you out. Yell if I'm about to carve up your face. It took a few more minutes, but at last Kase's face came into view, snow falling onto her cheeks as he cleared it away. He threw the machete he was using as a shovel aside and reached in to grab her other hand, tugging her out. At last he brought her to the surface and crushed her in a hug. She clung to him, her body still quivering with cold and shock. He held her tighter. You're safe. A few more moments, and the shaking in her limbs faded, leaving her skin bitterly cold. Kase pressed her closer to his side, worry pulling at his face. We need to get you warm and find a place for the night. He helped her stand, though he wobbled himself. Blood soaked the leg of his trousers and the snow he'd knelt on. She wrapped her arms up in his, and they held each other, stumbling off, trying not to fall into the packed snow from the avalanche.
Think the Cerulene got caught in that?
Hallie asked, her teeth chattering. Ice settled in her bones. Kase slid his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer. Not sure.
Yarrow?
He pressed his lips in a firm line, clearly worried but not about to respond. They wound their way through the trees, each one a giant, throwing shadows over the forest floor that shaded them from the sun. They kept close to the mountainside until she spotted a dark crevice nestled into the base of the mountain.
There!
Kase hobbled toward it. The cave stood out against the snow, and if aftershocks swept through, it might get buried. They had little choice, though. Kase's breath labored as they walked, his limp worsening with each step. Hallie's body shook under the snow permeating her clothes. The cave stretched wide and tall, with a sturdy overhang near the mouth. Rock walls ushered them in, cold and brutal, but clean. Nothing had made its nest here. Hallie nearly cried with relief. It would work for the night. She helped Kase inside and eased him to the cold ground, listening to him sigh with relief as the weight lifted off his injured leg. Without his meager body heat, she shivered even more violently. He slipped his pack off, digging through it. He tugged out a shirt, trousers, socks, and his trainee pilot's jacket, throwing them in a slightly less wet heap at Hallie's feet. You can wear these, otherwise you'll catch your death. She gathered up the clothing with quaking fingers. The wind stayed outside the cavern, relieving some of the bitterness she felt. It was a miracle she hadn't succumbed to hypothermia yet. She held Kase's clothes close to her chest and peered around, looking for somewhere private to change. But with its intimacy and the waning light, nothing in the cavern presented itself as appropriate. Kase pushed himself along the cave floor, inching toward the mouth. I'll sit at the edge of the cave and keep watch. You change. Hallie smiled, a little warmth entering her heart. Thanks. His clothes engulfed her. The shirt sleeves flopped comically past her fingertips, and with the shirt tucked into the waistband, it fell to mid-thigh. She used her sodden maiden belt to keep the trousers from falling and frowned at her icy toes wiggling freely about in his socks. But with the exploded remnants of her pack buried beneath the avalanche, she didn't have a choice. She laid out her wet clothes and hoped they wouldn't turn to solid ice before she could wear them again. While Kase's shirt was nice and dry, it wasn't her favorite lace. What were they going to do now? They'd freeze to death without a fire, yet they couldn't risk one if the Searles were in the pass. Hallie hated to think about why they were there in the first place. If they'd slipped past Achilles' defense, or worse, they'd defeated the forces at Achilles. No, they were probably a rogue band. Stoneset had been raided several times when she was growing up. That was the risk of living on the border. They were worrisome, but not as devastating as an avalanche or sub-zero temperatures. The natural elements threatened them more than a pack of bandits, especially without a fire. All the legends she'd heard as a child replayed in her head. Hikers going missing, found buried beneath the snow weeks later, or the blacksmith's daughter losing 6 toes to frostbite after trying to run away in the dead of winter. Hallie's breathing sped up.
Kase, what are we...
He kept his eyes to the woods, watching for signs of life, but his gloved fingers bit into his wrist.
The cave will protect us from the wind and snow. We'll be fine.
He paused.
Are you changed?
Yes.
He turned around and chuckled.
You've looked better.
Her teeth chattered as she stuffed her feet back into her boots.
Well, if only you weren't quite so tall, then maybe I wouldn't look so... What did you call yourself earlier? Dashing?
Kase's laughter echoed against the cavern walls, and Hallie's joined him.
Everything would be all right.
Kase scooted himself out of the opening and up against the wall with a grimace.
You'd look beautiful no matter what you wore.
Hallie's face caught aflame.
Thank you.
With trembling fingers, she fished out the cheese Kase had in his pack and gave him half. She joined him, leaning against a drier part of the cave, trying not to think of his nearness, his compliment, and the 1,000 things that could make things worse. Stupid, really. They'd weathered 2 of the worst. Her cheese was a little stiff from the cold, but she choked it down. As they finished their meager dinner, the light outside faded to black night. No sign of the Cerulens or Yarrow. It was a bittersweet feeling. Yarrow might have been rather crotchety, but he didn't deserve to die. Soon, small fractals of first moon's light stretched onto the newly fallen snow and into the entrance of the cave.
Might as well try to sleep, I guess, Kase said, nodding to his pack. Do you mind taking first watch?
She agreed immediately, watching the blood drying on the leg of his pants. Kase needed sleep. He was a stars idiot who refused to admit when he needed help, after all, and if she entrusted him to wake her if something happened to his leg, well, she had a suspicion he might just die instead. She laid out his bedroll and helped him into it. She grabbed his extra cloak and used it as a cushion as she sat a few feet away. It didn't help much. The cold seeped through, and she was sure if she didn't warm up soon she'd end up freezing to death. What were the symptoms of hypothermia again? Slurred speech, shivering? She couldn't recall the others. Jack had been the one fascinated with that sort of thing. Clenching her teeth as Kase shifted in his bedroll, she tried to remember days in the summer sun back in Stonesit and winter nights in front of the inn's fireplace. Anything warm. Maybe she could trick her brain into believing it was hot inside the dark cave. She shivered harder, her teeth chattering. Despite her best efforts, all she could think about was the snow piling on top of her, the ice seeping into her clothes as she waited for rescue. After what must have been a half hour, if not longer, she finally spoke up. Her jaw ached from the constant chattering.
Kase, could I light a fire?
He rolled over to face her.
I'm cold too, but lighting a fire now would be the worst thing we could do.
Hallie gritted her teeth, another chill ravaging her body.
I'm going to get hypothermia, or lose all my toes like the blacksmith's daughter, and I...
Hallie,
Kase said, pushing the blanket down so he could speak clearly.
You're not thinking straight. Breathe. You don't want to speed up your heart in times like this. I remember a little from pilot training.
She forced herself to breathe deeply.
Anything else?
Kase looked away.
Well, I know the best way to warm up is to trap the body heat, so we could, you could...
Hallie's cheeks blazed with heat. At least that warmed her for a second.
I'm not so far gone. I think I need skin-to-skin contact.
She caught sight of Kase's red face in a sliver of moonlight.
That's not what I meant. I only meant we could share this bedroll, and it's best to wear as many clothes as you can, unless you're going to... But it's not proper.
With a grimace, Kase rolled back over.
Then freeze to death in silence, please.
Stupid brat.
Hallie sat there, shivering still, the uneven bits of the cave floor digging into her bones. She twisted and adjusted herself, hoping to find a better position, but it was no use. The stories of people freezing to death in the mountains came back to her. She sat up.
Fine, but if you can't keep your hands to yourself, I'll kick your wound.
Kase snorted. I believe it. He sat up and undid the ties along the side. Hallie gathered the extra cloak and tucked it around her. After she'd helped Kase scoot over without jostling his leg too much, she took a deep breath and crawled in beside him, her back to his. He tied up the other side of the bag. As he settled in, he bumped her shoulder, and she tensed. She couldn't believe she was this close to him. He'd commented earlier about how she couldn't let her heart rate get up, and this wasn't helping, at all. And all this after he'd said she was beautiful no matter what she wore? Holy stars. She squirmed a little, trying to get comfortable, flinching a little every time she rubbed up against his back or his leg. Each little touch was like icy fire.
Why did I think this was a good option? Have I lost my mind? Was that one of the symptoms of freezing to death?
The image of the hiker's body, blue and frosted with ice like a macabre cake, bloomed in her mind. Great shocks, will you stop moving? Kase growled, his voice muffled. I promise to leave you alone, on my word as a gentle— Hallie elbowed him in the back. He cursed. What was that for?
Shut up, will you?
Women.
I heard that.
Kase didn't respond, but the muscles in his back relaxed a little. Hallie sat there, her shivers slowly dissipating as their shared warmth created a small cocoon around them. He knew his stuff. She had to give him credit for that.
Good night, Master Pilot.
She smiled at his soft, annoyed sound. You're not going to sleep, are you?
No, I'll wake you in a few hours.
After several minutes, she finally relaxed all the way. It was so much warmer, and she wiggled her thawing toes.
And thank you.
Her voice was a whisper, so she wasn't sure he'd heard it, but after a few seconds his chest rumbled with a low laugh. Good night, Yalvs. Hallie woke with the first rays of sunlight peeking through the opening of the cave. She hadn't frozen to death, a near miracle. They needed to get moving soon if they were to make it to the end of the pass by sundown. If they were lucky, they could take the forest road and sleep at her father's inn tonight. The idea of sleeping in a real bed was almost enough to quell the anxiety of seeing her parents and Niels again. Granted, it'd be slow going with Kase's leg. Air met her back. At some point while she'd slept, Kase had extricated himself from the bedroll. She must have been extraordinarily tired not to wake as he did so. He leaned against the cave wall, weight off his injured calf and holding his electro-pistol loosely. Hallie sat up. The cave floor was chilly even through her gloves.
How are you feeling?
Kase shrugged and pushed himself off the wall, limping to his bag. Sore, but I can put a little more weight on it today.
Good.
She looked away down at the mud-streaked blankets.
You don't think Yarrow is alive?
No.
But how do you know?
Hallie picked at a loose string.
Maybe he's out there looking for us.
Kase found the rest of the food Hallie had buried underneath his other effects the previous evening. He pulled out the wrapped cheese, probably too cold to eat now. Not with the way the Cerulene bullet hit him. He'd have bled out by now if he avoided the avalanche. I'm sorry. Hallie blinked away the moisture in her eyes. Yarrow hadn't been the best traveling companion. He'd been ill-tempered, he'd been greedy. But he'd helped rescue Kase. He'd taken the bullet for them. Kase's muttered curse followed a soft tinkling against the rocky floor. A ring rolled toward her. She picked it up when it stopped next to her. It was thin and dainty, made of what looked like zuprium with its bronze sheen. The edges were shaped into tiny vines leading to a trio of roses. Small diamonds dotted the band at regular intervals. Kase held his hand out. Blasted thing is too loose because of the cold. Shouldn't have taken off my gloves.
Why are you wearing a ring to begin with?
Hallie asked, setting it in his outstretched hands.
You secretly engaged or something?
Kase slipped it onto his pinky finger and replaced his gloves. It was Anna's. I've never come close to marrying anyone, much to my mother's dismay. Hallie pulled herself to her feet and packed away the bedroll. You're lucky. If by lucky you mean having your mother question your every motive as to why you haven't found some girl to chain yourself to until death do you part, then sure, I'm blasted lucky. Hallie attached the roll to Kase's pack and grabbed the cheese he'd left out. She broke it into 2 halves. It wasn't much, and one half was much larger than the other because her fingers tingled from the cold. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Kase limped over, taking the smaller bit of cheese. His face was above hers, his eyes shadowed in the dim light. She turned away from him. What could she say to that? She didn't like thinking of those awful memories. Why did she have to open her mouth? Why couldn't she ever just shut up? Nothing. We need to go. Hallie. Her boots echoed off the stone wall with each step. I shouldn't have said anything. Sorry. Kase closed his pack and slung it onto his shoulders. He followed her into the snowy dawn. Tell me. Hallie pulled the hood of her cloak up. I want to find my parents, want to make sure they're all right, but there's a reason I haven't visited since I arrived in Kaivenna. Not on holidays or breaks. I didn't want to face them. And Niels. Niels? Hallie hoped the shadow of her hood hid her warming cheeks. They walked for a few minutes in silence. With whatever was budding between her and Kase, she didn't want to ruin it by talking about her past, but Kase deserved to know. He'd come this far with her, been arrested, thrown into a jail cell, shot by Cerulene, and nearly killed in an avalanche. If she couldn't trust him, she couldn't trust anyone. She paused, focusing on a single snowflake fluttering from the sky above to join its brethren below. Kase's boots paused beside hers. She spoke to her toes. Niels and I were sweethearts. Kase didn't move, didn't seem to breathe. But now that Hallie's secret was out, she couldn't stop. But Jack died, and I found a life I love at the university. I haven't been home, barely written because I can't. Not after Jack, not after I've discovered what truly makes me happy. Yet I feel guilty, because if he hadn't died, I might never have realized how unhappy I was. And now that I know, I can't go back to that life. Tears left burning cold trails on her cheeks. She swiped at them. The only person who has any control over how you feel is you. His voice was soft, a whisper. Besides, maybe it was a stroke of luck you ended up in Kaivenna, but I'm sure glad you did. She looked up at him through her tears. He stared back, a soft, solemn expression on his face. He'd only looked at her this way once, so genuine and open. It had been that night in the trapper's cabin with the caramels. She was Hallie Walker, intelligent, spirited, and stubborn as the stars. A bubble formed in her chest. Thank you. Kase glanced away for a second, as if trying to process exactly what he wanted to say next. Do you still have feelings for Niels? The name was still like a gut punch. She'd never closed off that part of her life, only hid it beneath books and charcoal pencils in Kaivenna. She picked at the hem of the trainee pilot's jacket she wore. He's part of the past I'd rather forget. After a beat, Kase squeezed her shoulder. Thank you for telling me. He turned her toward him fully, his gloved hands cradling her upper arms. She gazed into his 2 blue eyes. The curve of his jaw was lined with stubble again. He leaned forward until his cold lips met her forehead. It was brief, but it was enough to set her heart aflutter. I promise, everything will be okay.
When did you become such an optimist? Her words came out jumbled. He smiled, and her knees wobbled for a moment despite the memories so fresh in her mind. Just now, I guess. The feeling wasn't new. She'd nearly kissed him that night they danced by the fire. She was falling for him, but that was dangerous. Dangerous because she didn't know what awaited her in Stonesit. She didn't know where he was going afterward. Likely she'd never see him again, and her already shattered heart couldn't survive another breaking. He searched her eyes for a moment before stepping back, hands falling to his sides. She looked away, off to where Stonesit lay. Glad to hear it. She tucked her feelings away, shoving them down deep until she could sort them out. She started off. We don't want to spend another night in the cold, do we? Around midday, they stopped for only a few minutes to take a swig of the insulated canteen they'd brought along. Not that it gave them much to drink. Kase gave Hallie a frozen caramel to suck on. The sugar was nice, but not as good as if she were able to chew it. She wished she could say something other than thank you, but anything she said now seemed awkward and forced. She'd laid her soul bare, and he hadn't scolded her for it. He hadn't scoffed, he'd understood. She didn't want to shatter that new whatever it was with meaningless words, lest he'd take it all back. It also didn't help that Hallie's stomach ached from the lack of what little food they had brought with them. It felt like ages since they'd stopped in Laurent and had a full meal. It was almost impossible not to dream of what awaited her in Stonesit. Winter vegetable stew, toast that crunched in her teeth, juicy, tender roasted lamb. The dread that had filled her stomach before now gave way to ravenous hunger. She might have to face her past at the end of this road, but at least she'd be well fed. When the sun drooped toward the horizon hours later, they stumbled across the first sign they were nearing the edge of the pass. Without thinking, she grabbed Kase's arm and pointed at a smudge on the horizon. Kase squinted in the distance. Military outpost? The one closest to Stonesit. Hallie shook out her hands and feet, trying to bring more warmth to them. They allow boys from the village to visit. Those interested in joining up, that is. Jack went once and returned saying he regretted it. Hallie laughed at the memory of his dejected face. Said he didn't fancy having someone yell at him because he didn't make his bed properly. Kase leaned on his good leg. And you? You never thought about joining the military? I want to open a school one day. I remember you telling Mother that. Wanted to do it ever since I moved to Kaivenna. They walked for a little bit in silence before Kase said, And what about before? Did you not want to do that when you lived in Stonesit? Hallie stopped, biting her lip. It was a casual question, and one that was expected, but it still caught her off guard. Kase turned. What? She didn't look up at him as she trudged ahead. Jack wanted to be a healer, and, as the firstborn by a mere 3 minutes, the savings were his for the taking. The only life left for me was to marry, though I'd inherit the inn. That's not fair. It's not a bad thing. I've grown up since then. I still want to marry, but I also want to follow my dreams. Kase didn't say anything as they continued to trudge toward the outpost. Hallie refused to look at him. Had she misread him? Oh, stars, did he think she was hinting at the fact that she wanted to marry him? That hadn't been her intention at all. She'd merely been honest. But that didn't mean she necessarily wanted that with Kase, though that possibly wasn't as egregious as it had been last autumn. Except he was leaving once she was in Stonesit. It couldn't happen, and he probably thought of her as one of those social climbers who preyed upon rich men. Hallie chewed on the inside of her cheek before speaking. That is, if I find someone willing to put up with my incessant need to devour literature and my penchant for the smell of dusty tomes. Kase chuckled. I understand the feeling. Well, that was cryptic. As they approached the outpost, Hallie let the conversation drop and looked for signs of habitation, but no smoke billowed from a chimney. No one patrolled the outer perimeter.
Had they stopped using this one? The tower itself was built more like a sturdy lighthouse. It climbed until the roof reached a point where a weathered Jaydian flag flew, a tree within a sun on a green field. The frayed ends flapped sharply in the wind whistling in from the mountains. Hallie gestured toward the trees where she knew another path lay. I haven't seen anyone, but I think we should take the forest road to Stonesit. I assume the soldiers in Nar have alerted their counterparts here about us?
Probably.
She led him to the edge of the woods, where a slim but worn path lay. As a girl, she'd visited the outpost once, but it was only because she and Jack had stolen away up the mountain path to play. Jack had told her the tower was a witch's lair, and the men patrolling were the minions she sent to find humans for her ritual sacrifice to retain eternal youth. They'd only been 9 years old at the time, so Hallie believed every word, as Jack had just read a folktale about that very subject. It seemed plausible, with the vines crawling up the brickwork and the point at the top piercing the summer sky. Niels had found them and ruined the whole thing by pointing out the guards wore uniforms with the Jaydian emblem on their breast. Jack had still fought with him, claiming it was all a ruse, when a patrol found them and marched the trio back to the village. Mama's lips had turned white when the men told her where Jack and Hallie had been playing. Hallie had been cross with the soldiers for ratting them out, but how were they to know that Mama had set her and Jack to weeding the back garden? A little over 3 miles away, Niels waited. Would she be married to him with a babe in her stomach by now, if things had gone differently? Would she be tending her father's inn? Had the Cerulens attacked and destroyed everything? Was Niels even there? Or had he fought until his last breath before help could arrive? She didn't think she wanted to know, and she didn't deserve to. She'd run away, hadn't she? With that thought in mind, she led Kase into the dark, her waking thoughts filled with memories of warm nights by a raging fire playing stars and blasts, wearied miners with Zuprium-dusted faces, and 2 mischievous boys who'd allowed her to join their adventures. Chapter 25. Stars-Blasted Kingdom. Kase. The forest was silent. Snow and the coming evening had sent the birds to their homes. Kase's eyes adjusted to the darkness of the surrounding trees, which created a premature night. The trail they followed was nothing more than a path of dampened snow weaving around white-mantled boulders. Bald patches of rock broke the snowy surface like the heads of kings presiding over their wooded kingdom. The trail was littered with footprints, though none of them human, mostly cloven hooves and something with paws. Kase ran his fingers along his electro-pistol grip. His leg ached, and he'd nearly tripped twice on the forest path. Walking so far on an injury the day after receiving said injury was the worst thing he could do for it, but Kase wasn't a medic. Zeke had been. What would his brother have said? What would he have done? Knowing Zeke, he would have spouted off some sort of encouragement while still warning Kase of all the things that could possibly go wrong, all of which Kase would have simply ignored. Kase blinked away, the stinging in his eyes. He pulled the electro-pistol from his trousers and lit up the muzzle to see by, but it would also do well in a fight if needed, whether soldier or clawed beast. Now was not the time to dwell on his past. He hoped soldiers didn't wait at the end of this road. Avoiding the outpost altogether had been a good idea, and if they entered the village at night, then maybe they could sneak in without many problems. He thought about how, once Hallie was finished in Stonesit, she'd go home to Kaivenna. Without him. He'd lost Anna, Zeke, and Ben, even Erevan. How much more could his heart take? Now his mother and Jove joined that list, though not in the same way. He'd never see them again if everything went according to his plan. Erevan's words rang in his ears as if he was right there next to him, their syllables cutting to his very core. He worked his jaw as he focused on Hallie's back. When they reached the edge of the trees, Hallie stopped, holding up a hand. "Wait!" Kase adjusted his pack and took in the view. Stones it sprawled before them in the moonlight. Houses, more like rustic cottages from a first earthen fairy tale with their painted upper floors and thatched roofs, dotted the mountainside. Darkened street lamps lined the lane that wove out of sight and into the village proper. The only illumination was the moonlight above on newly fallen, undisturbed snow. No one had cleared the paths through the labyrinth of homes and shops. It reminded Kase of a perfectly iced cake at the bakery near his old upper school. Hallie glanced back at Kase. "I don't understand." "How late is it?" He shifted his weight to his good leg. Shucks, he needed to rest. She stumbled down the slope before Kase could stop her. "I guess I won't have to worry about being turned into the military here. Terrible security." They entered the town. The ground floors of the buildings were constructed of stone, and more unlit lanterns draped above doorway arches. He followed Hallie through the winding streets until they found themselves facing a large building with empty flower boxes hung beneath the ground floor window. There was a wooden placard over the door. Walker's Rest. "Is this it?" Kase asked. This place looked like it hadn't been inhabited in quite some time, save for the dim light emanating from within. It stood 3 stories tall, the stone chimney breaking up the front facade and stretching to the starry sky above. Dry, wispy vines with curled leaves snaked up its side. Kase thought he recognized the pastoral scene depicted in the stained glass of the front window. "Papa never goes to bed this early." Hallie put her hand on the door handle. "Hals, we don't even know what time it is." Hallie's hand tightened on the door as she looked back. "Keep watch out here, will you?" "Are you sure you don't want me to come in with you?" "I'm sure." She stared at the handle. Kase shifted his feet, the unease growing in the pit of his stomach. She finally shook her head. "I'll be a moment." He stepped up beside her and grabbed her arm, pulling her into a hug. She hesitated for a moment before burrowing her head into his shoulder and snaking her arms around him. Kase's heart beat too hard. Her mountain air scent didn't stand out here now that they were in the Nardens, but it calmed his nerves nonetheless. He took a deep breath before stepping back and handing her his electropistol. "Just in case." "But what about you?" "I have an extra." She nodded once and entered the building. He remembered when Anna had passed, how he couldn't bear to even walk by her room at the manor. Must be a similar feeling for Hallie. He didn't think he'd want anyone intruding on his own grief. Shucks, they were quite the sorry pair. The small mountain town was as silent as the forest they'd just trekked through. Patches of wearied and cracked cobblestones peeked through the footprints Kase and Hallie had left behind. Something was wrong. Maybe since the attack on Achilles, Stoneset was under a strict curfew, but the snow sat undisturbed, and the sky was clear. It hadn't snowed for hours. If Kase looked closer at the houses, patches of repaired stone and boarded windows caught his attention. The cold feeling of dread pooled in his stomach. Kase whipped his head the other way just as something moved around the corner 2 buildings away. Blood pumping, heart pounding, he fished out the extra electropistol and set down his pack. With one last peek at the inn, assuring himself Hallie was fine if she was inside the building, he tiptoed toward the lip of the alley. He glanced up and down the road once more before stepping into it, electropistol cocked. The sparks from the tip danced in the shadows. Nothing. The end of the alley ran to the next street, shadowy alcoves lining the lane. But no one waited. The buildings were too close together for snowfall. No footprints. I'm on edge and weak from hunger, so I imagined whatever that was. The town was empty, for better or for worse. He was about to turn and head back toward the inn when the cool edge of a knife bit the skin of his throat. Kase froze, gripping the electropistol so hard he was sure it would leave permanent indentures in his palm. "Turn that weapon off if you know what's good for you," a deep voice growled behind him. Blistering shocks.
Kase's hand shook as he held the pistol tightly. The knife at his throat pressed deeper, and the voice grew more forceful.
I said, turn it off, or I'll slit your throat.
With his mouth going completely dry, he uncocked it. If the man gave him an opening, he could use the small hand-fighting techniques he knew, but any move he made now would slit his throat.
Try not to panic.
He had to pretend he was in a hover. Easy, right?
Much better, the voice said again. Now drop it. Who are you?
Kase managed to gasp. The knife dug into his skin even more, and Kase gritted his teeth against the pain, blood trickling over the edge of the blade and dripping onto his cloak.
I don't have any money.
A scream interrupted his words. Kase used the distraction and brought the heel of his boot down hard on where he estimated his attacker's toes to be. He winced against the sharp pain lancing through his leg at the motion. The grunt and clatter of the knife on the cobblestones were the answer he needed. He spun with his elbow up, catching the man in the jaw, knocking him into the side of the building. Kase grabbed the man's arm before he could react and twisted, bringing it around to his back, pushing his face into the stone wall with his other hand. The man went limp. Another scream split the air.
Hallie!
He shoved his own attacker and ran for the alley opening. His blasted leg slowed him down, and his neck ached from where the knife had bit into his skin, but he barely felt it. Nothing compared to the pure, unadulterated terror coursing through him. He turned the corner. Two men in dark uniforms pulled a struggling Hallie by her arms, pinning them behind her back as they covered her nose and mouth with a handkerchief. She went limp. The shorter of the two threw her on his partner's horse before swinging onto his own.
No!
Kase sprinted after the men. He slipped in the snowy patches and didn't care if anyone else lurked in the shadows, nor about his own attacker. All he could see was the auburn braid waving in the winter wind as the men galloped away. Without warning, Kase's leg gave out. He barely caught himself and saved his nose from a sure break. He rolled, scrambling, trying to get to his feet. His leg refused to cooperate.
Please,
he cried, reaching with useless fingers. His vision blurred as the horses disappeared from his sight.
No, I can't lose you, not like this.
He crawled, his fingernails digging into ice and the cracks between cobblestones underneath. His calf throbbed as he tried to climb to his feet once more, only to fall from the pain.
Guess you're not a blasted Cerul, then.
The voice was the same as earlier, though the gravelly tones were muddled with what sounded like a swollen lip. Kase's heart pounded in his chest as he grasped a loose stone and flipped over, ready to launch his pathetic attack, but the man held up his hands.
I don't mean you any harm. Except you nearly killed me not even 5 minutes ago,
Kase growled, still holding the stone. The rough edges bit into his fingers. The man was tall and rather muscular through his arms and shoulders, the sleeves of his jacket almost too tight. His bottom lip was swollen, and blood trickled out the side of his mouth and onto his tanned face. The man shook his head, the blonde hair catching in the moonlight.
And never be too careful. Besides, we should scat before the others come hunting.
Kase still didn't lower his stone.
Scat? Means get out of here.
The man's dark eyes were steady on Kase's.
Listen, I didn't mean to scare you, but if you'd been in my position, you would have done the same.
He reached into the back of his trousers and pulled out Kase's electro-pistol. With careful precision, he set the weapon on the cobblestones and took several steps back.
See? You're armed. I'm sorry about your neck.
Kase dropped the rock and grabbed his electro-pistol. He scooted into a position where he could pull himself up, but as soon as he put pressure on his leg, white fire shot through it into his hip, and he collapsed. His pistol clattered to the ground.
My leg! I injured it.
The man cautiously stepped forward.
I can help with that.
Kase cursed.
I can take you to someone who can fix you up.
Jaw clenched, Kase climbed to his knees, trying to keep weight off his injury. He didn't have time for this. He didn't have any blasting time. Taking a deep breath, he stood on his left leg, his good leg, and almost toppled over, but a strong hand caught his arm and helped him stand.
It's the least I can do.
Kase tugged his arm out of the man's grip and almost fell again, but the man caught him once more, slinging his arm over his shoulder.
Kase took a deep, steadying breath. I have to go after those men.
They're souls.
Those uniforms. They were soldiers. The ones who'd attacked them in the past had been wearing something similar. Had the avalanche not killed the rest of them? Hallie and Kase had been spared, so it wasn't out of the question. Kase shook his head. Achilles said they beat them back. The man's laugh was low and rumbling, yet it lacked any mirth.
I don't know what lie they tell where you come from, but those Yalvs never left.
Kase halted his hobbling and stared at the man's busted face. What do you mean? Where are the soldiers from Achilles?
The fort held out until about mid-January. We were grateful because it took the focus off us here.
The man shook his head.
In the end, it didn't matter. Let me formally welcome you to New Cerulene, the newest colony in King Philip's stars-blasted kingdom.